Some expeditions vanish without a trace, others return in pieces. Wreckage scattered, journals half-written, survivors unable to speak of what happened. Across oceans, mountains, and frozen frontiers, a strange pattern emerges. Groups of skilled, prepared individuals set out on clear missions and never come back. What they left behind wasn't just mystery, it was silence, confusion, and unanswered questions that continue to haunt those who search for them. In this documentary, we explore real journeys that began with purpose, but ended in madness, disappearances, or death. There were no final messages, no clean explanations, only the eerie sense that something went wrong, and no one ever figured out why. The vanishing of the Franklin expedition. In the summer of 1845, two ships, the HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, left England with over 100 men on board. Their mission was to chart the final untraveled portion of the Northwest Passage, a sea route through the Arctic that could connect the Atlantic and Pacific. Leading them was Sir John Franklin, a seasoned explorer with a reputation for endurance. The ships were outfitted with the best supplies the British Empire could offer. They had canned food, reinforced hulls, and steam engines. But once they sailed into the ice, no one ever saw them alive again. For over a year, there was no word. At first, this didn't cause alarm. Long Arctic expeditions often went silent for months. But as more time passed, concern grew. Families began to write letters. By 1848, the British Admiralty had no choice but to organize search missions. What they uncovered was a trail of clues scattered across thousands, of miles of frozen wilderness that hinted at something far darker than simply being stranded. A note was eventually found beneath a stone cairn on King William Island. It was dated April 25, 1848. In it, the officers wrote that the ships had become trapped in ice in 1846, almost 2 years earlier, and that they had been abandoned. Franklin had died, so had more than 20 men. The rest were now attempting to walk south towards safety, but that was only part of the story. Not long after the first skeletal remains were uncovered, search parties stumbled upon abandoned campsites whose arrangement hinted at a slow, methodical attempt to cling to survival. In some cases, cooking pots were found still resting on stones blackened by fire, their contents long since frozen into unrecognizable lumps. The careful positioning of bedrolls and makeshift windbreaks suggested that at least for a time, the men believed rescue was still possible, even as their supplies dwindled. Yet, mixed among these ordinary survival traces were unsettling anomalies. Personal letters torn into fragments, medical tools scattered far from where any treatment might have taken place, and even small piles of pebbles deliberately arranged, as if to mark something too important or too grim to be left unnoted. Environmental. Records from ice core samples taken in the region show that the winters of 1846 through 1848 were unusually harsh, with thicker pack ice and lower average temperatures than any year in decades. This would have locked the ships in with almost no chance of breaking free, crushing any realistic hope of continuing their mission. The men, already weakened, would have been forced into a grim calculation, whether to risk the unknown journey south or to endure another winter in a frozen prison that showed no mercy. Later, searchers found human remains along the route. Some were still dressed in bits of uniform. Others showed signs of blunt trauma. There were cut marks on bones, deep, deliberate ones like those made by knives. Some skulls had been opened. These details, taken together, suggested something chilling: cannibalism. The survivors may have eaten their dead to stay alive, or worse, they may have killed to survive. Among the dead was Harry Goods, the expedition's assistant surgeon and naturalist, whose well-preserved skeleton provided early evidence of severe nutritional and toxic stress. Medical tools and journals recovered near the remains hinted that the crew had tried to document their decline even as they began to fall apart. But not everything fit. The canned food they brought had been sealed with lead, and modern analysis suggests many of the crew may have suffered from lead poisoning. It would have affected their minds, caused confusion, hallucinations, madness. Combine that with scurvy and extreme cold, And it's easy to imagine discipline breaking down. Men arguing, trust dissolving, order collapsing. Inuit accounts added even more unsettling layers. Some locals described white men pulling sledges across the ice, moving slowly, their faces hollow. Others spoke of ships trapped far from where they should have been. One tale even told of a ship breaking free from the ice and sailing away under no one's control. These accounts were dismissed for years. But decades later, when the ships were finally found, more than 150 years after they disappeared, they were almost exactly where the Inuit had said. In 2014, a Canadian expedition discovered the wreck of the Erebus at the bottom of a shallow Arctic bay. 2 years later, the Terror was found as well, remarkably well preserved. Inside, drawers were still filled with artifacts. Plates remained on shelves. Boots sat next to the beds. It looked as if the men had simply vanished. Inside the ship's most private quarters lay details that deepened the enigma. Unfinished logbooks with calm, final entries, neatly stowed clothing, and unopened medicine bottles perfectly in place. One officer's cabin contained a locked chest that, when pried open, revealed nothing but a stack of neatly wrapped handkerchiefs, each one meticulously marked with initials, none matching the crew list. This eerie order, preserved for over a century, contrasted sharply with the chaos implied by the skeletal. Evidence found on land as though two parallel realities had unfolded, one of sudden abandonment,
and another where life aboard
continued quietly until the very last moment. Even with modern forensics, many questions remain. Why did the crew stay on the ships for so long after they were trapped? Why were the bodies of some men found dozens of miles from the known route? Why did they seem to split up? And why were some of them found carrying silverware even when starving? There's no single answer that explains everything. No final document, no survivor's account, just fragments, a letter, a bone, a rusted tin, pieces of a story that drift in and out of focus, depending on how you try to arrange them. The Franklin expedition was meant to be a triumph of empire, a symbol of British might and discovery. Instead, it became a frozen riddle. The men went into the ice with pride and purpose. They vanished with no witnesses, and even now, long after their bodies were claimed by snow and silence, their fate remains one of the strangest cold case mysteries in exploration history. The mystery of the USS Cyclops. March 4, 1918 was a calm day in Barbados when the USS Cyclops pulled anchor and set course for Baltimore. The ship had already traveled thousands of miles from Brazil, carrying over 10,000 tons of manganese ore used to harden steel for the war effort. On board were 306 people, sailors, Marines, and civilians, making it one of the largest American naval vessels to vanish without a trace. The sea was quiet, the skies clear, no distress signals were sent, and after that day, the Cyclops was never heard from again. Rather than panic, the Navy first assumed a delay. Wartime disruptions were common, and the ship had made several stops during its voyage up the Atlantic. But as days turned to weeks and no ports reported sightings, concern hardened into something else. Multiple search efforts were launched along the expected route. Not a single piece of wreckage surfaced. Not a single body was recovered. The Atlantic, it seemed, had simply swallowed the ship whole. One of the more disturbing parts of the story is that the Cyclops wasn't just any transport ship. It was a Proteus-class sea collier nearly 550 ft long and considered structurally sound. It had served in various missions across the world since 1910, including support operations in the Caribbean and along the East Coast. It wasn't without flaws, but its disappearance was baffling. No storms were reported.
No enemy submarines were active in the area.
It was as if the entire ship had evaporated. Long after the last hope of finding survivors had faded, fragments of testimony began to emerge from ports where the Cyclops had stopped prior to its disappearance. Dock workers in Rio de Janeiro recalled seeing the vessel riding unusually low in the water, far more than other collars of its class, which led some to suspect the ore had been loaded unevenly. Naval engineers later noted that a subtle but persistent imbalance could over a long voyage strain the ship's internal framework to the point where even a moderate swell might trigger a catastrophic failure. Yet if such a disaster had occurred, the suddenness required to erase all trace. Without a single distress call remained deeply troubling. An examination of wartime records decades later revealed that the region where the Cyclops vanished was dotted with uncharted shams and deep-sea trenches, some dropping abruptly for thousands of feet. In those depths, a vessel of that size could vanish entirely, its weight and steel hull carrying it straight into the darkness before debris had a chance to surface. This theory might explain the absence of wreckage, but it failed to account for the sheer improbability of such an accident happening in calm seas under the watch of an experienced crew. Captain George W. Waller, the man in charge of the Cyclops, has drawn more than a little suspicion. Described by some as erratic and by others as secretive, Wally had a history that raised eyebrows. He had previously served under a different name and wasn't well liked by his crew. Some survivors from earlier voyages said he'd often walk the decks in his underwear, carrying a cane and muttering to himself. Reports even surfaced that tension on board was running high before the ship disappeared. Arguments, discipline issues, and low morale. But if the captain had snapped, how could that explain an entire ship going missing without warning? The idea of sabotage was also explored. Some speculated that a German sympathizer had boarded the ship or tampered with its hull, but no evidence ever surfaced. Others suggested the ore itself may have played a role. 10,000 tons of heavy cargo could have shifted suddenly in rough seas, causing a catastrophic list. But that doesn't explain why no one aboard tried to send an SOS. The ship had a working radio. It was equipped to call for help, and yet nothing. Its disappearance became one of the earliest and most haunting cases tied to what would later be called the Bermuda Triangle. The area between Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico already had a reputation for strange events. But the Cyclops became one of its central legends. Even the US Navy, which normally avoids superstition, has never fully explained what happened. It officially lists the loss as due to unknown causes. Decades later, two of the Cyclops sister ships, the Proteus and the Neuras, would also vanish under similar conditions while carrying the same type of ore. Both were traveling in nearby waters. Both disappeared without sending distress signals. The eerie pattern only deepened the mystery, leaving many to wonder if the design of the ships had a fatal flaw, or if something stranger was at work in those waters. No final voyage logs have ever been recovered, no last messages, not even a floating life preserver. It's as if the Atlantic opened its mouth, took the ship in, and then sealed itself shut. Families were left with no answers, just silence and speculation. The Navy held inquiries. Committees reviewed every scrap of information. But over a century later, there is still nothing solid to hold on to. Archival letters from crew families uncovered another intriguing detail. A few men had mailed cryptic notes home from earlier ports hinting at unrest on board. One sailor wrote that things are not as they seem and urged his family to trust nothing you read if bad news came. Another mentioned orders that make no sense, suggesting that their course may have been altered before leaving Barbados. These hints, though impossible to verify, have fueled the idea that the Cyclops' last voyage may have included a destination or mission far from the one recorded in official logs, leaving open the unsettling possibility that its disappearance was not an accident
At all.
but the outcome of a plan designed to ensure it would never return. What makes the Cyclops case so unsettling isn't just the size of the ship or the number of lives lost, it's the lack of evidence, the absence of noise, the void where explanation should be. Hundreds of people vanished in peacetime in good weather in full daylight, and somehow no one knows why. The sea keeps its secrets well, but few of them are as heavy, as quiet, or as complete as this one. The Dyatlov Pass incident. When the rescue team reached the tent, they found it half collapsed and strangely cut open from the inside. It was still anchored in place on the slope of a remote Ural mountain known to locals as Dead Mountain. Inside, the hikers' belongings were undisturbed, boots lined up, journals neatly stacked, food supplies untouched, but the hikers were gone. What started as a routine recovery mission quickly spiraled into one of the most disturbing mysteries in modern history. The group had been made up of 9 experienced mountaineers from the Ural Polytechnic Institute. Their leader, Igorodat, was known for his discipline and planning. They had set out on January 23, 1959, hoping to earn their highest-level hiking certification by crossing the Ural Mountains in the middle of winter. Photos and diary entries recovered later show the group in good spirits just days before their disappearance. They were young, smart, and used to harsh conditions, but nothing in their training could have prepared them for what happened next. Days passed with no contact. When their return date came and went, families grew worried. A search party was launched in early February. The tent was found on February 26th, high on the slope of Hullet. From there, investigators followed a trail of frozen footprints leading down the slope. Prints that appeared to have been made by people walking barefoot or in socks. No sign of a struggle, no blood, just tracks fading into the snow. Not far from the tree-ine, 2 bodies were found beside the remains of a small fire. They were half naked, wearing only underwear. The branches above them were broken, suggesting someone had climbed the tree, possibly to look for the others. A few hundred meters away, 3 more hikers were discovered, frozen in poses that suggested they were trying to crawl back to the tent. Still, none of this explained why the group had fled in such a panic. The last 4 were found 2 months later, buried beneath several feet of snow in a small ravine. Their injuries were far worse. One had a crushed skull, another had broken ribs. One woman was missing her tongue and eyes. Yet, there were no external wounds, nothing to match the violence of the internal damage. Soviet pathologists at the time compared the force to that of a car crash. The explanation didn't fit the terrain, the weather, or the group's behavior, and made no sense. When searchers examined the scene more closely, they found signs that didn't seem to belong in a natural disaster. Some of the hikers' clothing had been cut into strips, apparently used as makeshift bandages or to share warmth. But others wore garments belonging to different group members, as though clothes had been redistributed in the dark without time to think. Melted snow near the ravine bodies indicated a temporary heat source, but no remnants of firewood or fuel were found, raising the question of what they had burned, or if the heat came from something else entirely. The snow around them showed faint, unusual depressions, almost circular, which investigators at the time dismissed as damage from thawing ice. Later, analysts argued they were too regular to be random, adding to the mystery. Official autopsy notes describe a bronzelle-like discoloration on some faces and hands, accompanied by oddly brittle hair. These conditions, rarely caused by exposure alone, fueled speculation about chemical agents or high-intensity heat. The lack of external bruising paired with catastrophic internal damage only deepened the confusion. It was as if the bodies had been struck by immense force without ever being touched. Over the years, dozens of theories have been proposed. An avalanche seemed likely at first, but the slope wasn't steep enough, and no signs of one were ever found. Others suggested military testing. The area was remote and sometimes used for secret operations. Some even believe the hikers stumbled into a classified experiment and were silenced, but no evidence has ever surfaced to support it. The official Soviet report closed with the vague statement, "A compelling natural force caused their deaths." One detail that continues to haunt researchers is the sheer coordination of the group's behavior. These weren't amateurs. For them to leave the warmth of the tent in freezing temperatures without proper clothing or shoes, points to sudden, overwhelming fear. Something must have scared them enough to abandon all logic. But what could terrify 9 seasoned hikers into running barefoot into the snow-covered darkness? Radiation was found on some of the hikers' clothing, adding to the confusion. So did the strange orange tint on some of the body's skin and the grey hair of one member who was only in his 20 eyes. Photographs taken on their final days show blurry lights in the sky, fueling speculation about secret aircraft or something even stranger. But with most of the case files sealed or lost for decades, it's hard to tell where the facts end and the legends begin. Following years of speculation and conspiracy theories, the case was reopened in 2019 by Russian officials who concluded once more that a small slab avalanche was likely responsible. But even with new simulations and expert opinions, the new findings failed to convince many. The tent had not been buried. The injuries still didn't match. The fear still couldn't be explained. In the decades following the tragedy, residents from nearby Manatsi villages spoke of strange sounds in the mountains during the winter of 1959.
Low, droning hums that seemed to come from nowhere and carry through the air for miles. One elderly hunter recalled seeing a faint glow moving slowly along the ridge on the very night the hikers were believed to have died, describing it as a lantern in the clouds that had no flame.
Military archives from that period remain incomplete, but declassified fragments show that an unusual number of overflights occurred in the area that month, none of which were officially acknowledged in weather or navigational records. Whether these were routine operations or something far stranger is still unknown, but for many they add one more shadow to a night already filled with unanswered questions. The Dyatlov Pass incident remains one of the most unsettling, unsolved events of the 20th century. No answers have ever truly satisfied the questions left behind in the snow. Something happened on that mountain, something that caused 9 rational, well-trained people to run into the freezing night and die in confusion, pain, and silence. Whatever it was, it has never been found. The lost expedition of Percy Fawcett. Not long after disappearing into the Amazon, Colonel Percy Fawcett became a ghost whose name was whispered around campfires and scratched into jungle maps. He had gone in search of a lost city he called Z, a place he believed held ruins older than anything found in South America. With him were his 21-year-old son, Jack, and Jack's friend, Raleigh Rimmel. The trio left the Brazilian town of Coiaba in April 1925 and were last seen near the edge of the jungle weeks later, calm and confident.
After that, nothing.
Foray was no fool. He was a decorated British officer, a seasoned explorer, and one of the few men who could navigate the jungle without losing his mind. Earlier expeditions had made him a legend. He claimed to have seen strange animals, deadly tribes, and ancient carvings deep in the forest. But this journey felt different. He had planned it carefully, avoided large groups, and even left instructions that if he vanished, no rescue attempts should be made. He seemed to know the danger he was walking into. The route he took led him into the Mat Grau, a region so vast and untouched that even now parts of it remain unexplored. Early letters sent during the trip showed optimism. Fawcett wrote of good weather and steady progress. But after June 1925, the messages stopped. Months passed, then years, and still no sign. The jungle gave nothing back. Rather than bringing closure, the search turned into its own mystery. In the decades after, over 100 people died looking for him. Some simply vanished, others returned barely alive, raving about hostile tribes, deadly insects, and sickness that crawled under the skin. Pieces of rumors began to surface. Some said Fawcett had been killed by a local tribe. Others believed he had gone mad and chosen to disappear, building a new life deep in the forest. A few even claimed He had found Z and was guarding its secrets. One story came from a tribesman who said his people had killed 3 white men long ago. Another came from a missionary who believed Fawcett had been captured and kept as a prisoner for years. None of the stories ever lined up. Bones were found, then ruled out. Campsites were discovered, but none could be proven to be his, and so the mystery only deepened. In the years following his disappearance, fragments of second-hand accounts drifted into newspapers and letters, each carrying its own shadow of truth and fabrication. One Brazilian rubber trader claimed to have heard distant drumming in an uncharted valley and seen 3 pale-skinned figures being led by warriors decorated in jaguar pelts. An image so vivid it captured the public's imagination, even as skeptics dismissed it as a tale for profit. Other reports told of carved stone pillars hidden in vine-choked clearings bearing geometric designs unlike anything known from nearby tribes. These glimpses, unreliable as they were, fed the belief that Fawcett had crossed into a part of the forest where time itself seemed to warp, sealing outsiders inside. The physical reality of the terrain only deepens the plausibility of such vanishing. The Mato Grau swallows evidence with terrifying efficiency. Wood rots within weeks. Bones dissolve in the acidic soil, and the ceaseless churn of vegetation can erase an entire campsite in a single rainy season. Rivers shift their courses without warning, cutting new channels that strand travelers in hostile, waterlogged plains. For anyone injured or ill, the jungle's beauty becomes a trap from which there is no return. And in that world, silence is as fatal as the spear or the fever. Strangely, Fawcett wasn't reckless as he planned every detail of the journey, which only deepens the mystery of what went wrong. He avoided traveling during the rainy season, kept his party small to avoid attracting attention, and carried letters of introduction to several tribes. He even brought gifts, mirrors, beads, and fishing hooks to trade with locals. But perhaps the most telling detail is that he refused to carry firearms, believing violence would doom the mission. In such an unforgiving environment, it was a dangerous choice. Years later, some of Fawcett's notebooks turned up in Brazil, sold quietly by someone who claimed to have found them near an abandoned camp. They mentioned no disasters,
No threats, only the slow, steady movement through the jungle.
One cryptic line stood out. "You need to have no fear of failure." It sounded like confidence or denial. The city of Z that Fawcett dreamed of may not have been fantasy. In recent years, archaeologists have uncovered traces of massive ancient settlements buried beneath the Amazon canopy. Networks of roads, moos and plazas once thought impossible for early Amazonian people now appear to have existed. Foray may have been wrong about the exact location, but right that something extraordinary had once lived in the green silence. Modern expeditions retracing Fawcett's possible route have uncovered curious alignments between his notes and undiscovered archaeological sites, earthen mounds shaped like
Massive geometric figures visible only from the air and long forgotten.
causeways stretching between river systems. Some explorers who ventured deep into these areas returned with stories of uncounted tribes who spoke of a white-bearded man arriving generations ago offering strange
Gifts before vanishing into the
interior. None of these accounts has been verified, but their persistence suggests that somewhere buried beneath the canopy and the decades, the final chapter of Fawcett's journey may still lie waiting.
untouched by the outside world and perhaps better left that way.
Despite all this, his fate remains unknown. There is no confirmed grave, no final letter, no proof of success or failure. Just a line in history that ends in thick foliage where maps fade and rivers curve away from memory. Today, the story of Percy Fawcett is remembered not just for its mystery, but for how it represents the fine line between bravery and obsession. He walked into a place where the rules of the outside world no longer mattered. He believed in something so deeply that he was willing to vanish for it.
And he did.
Whatever happened in the forest, whether it was betrayal, accident, or discovery followed by silence, The jungle never gave back its secret. And maybe that's why the story still lingers. Because somewhere beyond the last known camp, beyond the bend of the Rio Xingu, a question remains suspended in the trees. What did Percy Fawcett find? And why did he never come back? The disappearance of George Mallory. High on Everest's unforgiving north face, a body was found lying face down in the scree, arms outstretched, fingers frozen into the slope. The clothing was wool from another time. There was a rope around the waist, torn clean, and a name stitched into a weather-worn label, George Mallory. He had disappeared in 1924, climbing toward a summit no one had reached, vanishing into cloud and speculation for 75 years. Long before Everest became a guided climb, it was a mythic wall of ice and wind. Mallory and his partner, Andrew Irvine, had set off from their final camp at around 26,800 FT with little more than hobnailed boots and rudimentary oxygen tanks. The date was June 8th. The last man to see them alive, climber Noel Odell, watched as two figures moved steadily upward through the mist toward a ridge just below the summit. Then the clouds closed in. Mallory and Irvine were never seen again. As the year slipped by, the unanswered fate of the 1924 expedition evolved beyond a mountaineering loss. It became a spectral tale passed from campfire to campfire and echoed through climbing circles across the globe. Survivors from earlier climbs recalled the way Mallory had studied maps late into the night, tracing ridge lines with his finger, as if committing every slope to memory. His own letters from the expedition spoke not of fear, but of an almost magnetic pull toward the summit, as if he believed the mountain itself demanded an answer from him. Those who knew him said he had a restlessness that would not allow him to turn back once committed.
Mallory was not simply an ambitious adventurer.
He was already known for bold attempts on Everest during earlier expeditions. He'd earned admiration for his skill, but also criticism for his risks. Yet this time the stakes were different. He had told friends he intended to leave a photo of his wife Ruth on the summit. He carried no radio, no means to call for help. Either they would return triumphant, or they would not return at all. Search teams combed the mountain after their disappearance, but found nothing. For decades, the mountain held its silence. Stories circulated with each new expedition, hoping to find a clue. An ice axe, a camera, final message buried in snow.
None ever surfaced.
The question grew colder, but it never died. Did Mallory and Irvine reach the summit nearly 3 decades before it was officially conquered? Over the decades, mountaineers pieced together a mosaic of small, tantalizing clues from scattered expeditions. Several climbers in the 1930s reported spotting what they believed to be an old body far above the modern routes, partially buried under snow. But shifting storms always erased the trail before it could be reached. Some Sherpa guides passed down stories of finding fragments of clothing in locations well above the known camps, their texture and weave unlike anything used in later years. A handful of oxygen cylinders matching the 1924 model were also discovered on the north face, placed in positions that suggest Mallory and Irvine were moving efficiently and high when they were last alive. If true, these findings imply that the pair had penetrated further toward the summit than most historians once believed. The physical conditions that day were brutal, even by Everest standards. Winds on the upper ridge can reach speeds capable of hurling a man from his footing, and snow can hide creases so thin they appear solid until stepped on. Without the advantage of modern crampons or downsuits, Mallory and Irvine faced a mountain that could turn lethal in minutes.
Any mistake, any misjudged.
Step could have set off the chain of events that ended with Mallory's frozen body lying where it was finally found. The breakthrough came in 1999, and American-led teams stumbled upon a body at 26,700 FT, far below the summit, but higher than most believe they would have fallen. The skin had been scorched white, by decades of sun and wind. The back of the head was torn, the tibia shattered, and the arms were drawn upward. Unnaturally, it was Malalari. His goggles were in his pocket. His fingers were still clutching the slope. Items found with the body suggested careful planning. An alimta, a pocket knife, and a letter from his wife. But one thing was missing. He had always said he would leave her photo on the summit. It wasn't with the body. No one could say whether it had been lost or left behind deliberately far above. One small envelope containing notes and receipts was also recovered, still legible despite decades of exposure. On one scrap was a reminder of oxygen adjustments, evidence that they were actively monitoring their flow rate during the climb. The small Kodak camera they carried has never been found. If it still lies buried with Irvine, it might hold images from the summit ridge, even the summit itself. The film would be degraded, but possibly recoverable. Modern teams have searched for Irvine's body ever since using drone surveys, ground-penetrating radar, and photographs of unidentified shapes in the snow. All attempts have failed. There is also the matter of the fall. Analysis of the body suggests Mallory fell while still roped to Irvine. The location, the injuries, and the broken rope indicate a rapid descent cut short by an abrupt stop. Whether they were on their way up or down has never been determined.
Mallory's position suggests he was descending.
Perhaps trying to control a fall or already too late to stop it. No journal pages survived, no summit flag, no discarded gear above their last known location. If they reached the top, they left no mark that anyone has found. If they turned back, they did so close enough for the summit to be within sight. What remains is an open timeline, one that ends somewhere between the clouds and the rock, frozen mid-stride. Up there, the mountain offers nothing in return. No markings, no scattered gear, no final photograph caught in the wind. Just the mountain unchanged, and the echo of a final attempt that ended in silence.
Mallory's story doesn't conclude with a discovery,
but with a body found decades too late to answer the only question that mattered. The summit logbook inside the first confirmed 1953 summit was blank. No earlier message tucked inside, no signature left behind. The mad tragedy of the Carl. The Carl was never meant for the ice. Originally built as a fishing vessel, it had been retrofitted for exploration barely. In 1913, when it was chosen as the flagship for the Canadian Arctic expedition, it was already aging. Its wooden hull no match for the crushing pressure of pack ice. But promises had been made. Scientific glory was within reach. And so the ship set sail from Nome, Alaska, under the leadership of Wilmer Stevenson, a man whose vision outpaced his caution. As summer turned to autumn, the sea began to freeze earlier than expected. The Karlak became trapped in the ice of the Bowoot Sea, drifting westward away from its intended course. Stevenson, claiming he was going inland to hunt, left the ship with a small party and never returned. Whether he intended to abandon the crew or believed he'd rejoin them later has never been clear. What is certain is that the Carl was left to drift deeper into the Arctic, helpless in the grip of the frozen ocean. For the 25 men, scientists, sailors, and Inuit guides left aboard, the isolation settled in fast. Supplies were limited. The cold intensified, and slowly the ship groaned under the shifting weight of the ice. Few could have imagined how quickly time would lose all meaning in the drifting prison of the Beaufort Sea, where days bled into one another beneath a pale, unchanging sky, and the sound of the wind seemed to gnaw at the edges of sanity. The men began to keep strange habits, some pacing the deck for hours, as if movement alone could hold off the cold, others retreating into silence, so completed unnerved their shipmates. Once eager to catalogue and draw the frozen horizon, the scientists now worked with notebooks stiffened by ice and pencils that shattered in their grasp. Each creak of the wooden hull was no longer just a sound of strain. It became a warning, a reminder that the ice was patient and unyielding, and that it intended to claim what it had trapped. As days passed, cracks echoed through the hull. On January 10, 1914, the pressure became too much. The ice crushed the Karluk, splintering it in hours. With no ship, no shelter, and no help coming, the survivors gathered their remaining gear and set up camp on the ice itself. They were now stranded more than 80 mitsa from Wrangel Island, the closest land. Their only hope was to haul lifeboats and supplies across the ice, pulling everything by hand. Temperatures dropped below 40 degrees. Blizzards erased the horizon, and with every mile they lost more.
Hunger crept in.
Frostbite took fingers. One man wandered off into the snow and was never seen again. Another succumbed to illness, muttering deliriously until he went still. The ice cracked beneath their feet at night, forcing them to move constantly to stay ahead of leads opening in the floes. Eventually, after weeks of crawling over shifting ice, they reached the edge of Wrangler Island. But safety didn't follow. What awaited them was another barren, frozen world. They had no way of knowing how long they'd be stuck there. And as time dragged on, tempers frayed. Hunger turned men against each other. Rumors of theft and sabotage spread. The sense of unity that once held the group together began to fracture under the weight of exhaustion and fear. As the weeks dragged on, the island's frozen silence seemed to grow heavier, pressing into the minds of those stranded there. At night, some swore they heard voices in the wind, distant. Half-formed words carried from nowhere, fading as quickly as they came. Others claimed to glimpse shapes moving beyond the reach of the firelight, figures that vanished when approached, leaving only disturbed snow in their wake. Whether it was the hunger, the isolation, or the endless howl of the Arctic air, a shared unease began to settle over the camp, as though they were not entirely alone on that barren rock. Superstitions once laughed off took on a sharper edge. Men began keeping talismans in their pockets, bits of bone or carved wood given by the Inuit guides, said to guard against spirits that wandered the ice. And while no one could agree on what they truly feared, each man knew that the Arctic had a way of claiming not just the body, but the mind. One man, Seaman Charles Barker, was accused of hoarding food. Another reportedly tried to trade false promises of help for extra rations. Fights broke out.
A sense of quiet madness took hold.
The Inuit guides, accustomed to the harshness of Arctic life, built makeshift shelters and tried to keep the group alive. Their skills became the only real line between survival and death. Without them, more would have died. Captain Robert Bartlett, determined to save what was left of his crew, eventually made a bold decision. Alongside an Inuit hunter named Katakavik, he set off on foot and sled for Siberia to find help. The journey took months. They crossed hundreds of miles of ice and uncharted territory, traveling through the Chukchi Peninsula and facing near starvation themselves. But Bartlett succeeded. He reached civilization and arranged a rescue. By the time help arrived at Wrangler Island in September 1914, nearly a year had passed since the kook had been crushed. Of the original 25 on board, only 14 survived. The rest had died from exposure, hunger, and despair. Some simply vanished into the snow, their final moments unknown. Diaries recovered later spoke of strange dreams, hallucinations, and the constant sound of cracking ice, like the earth itself was breathing beneath them. Even now, the Karlak story is often overshadowed by more famous polar disasters, but few matched its slow, creeping collapse, where leadership faltered, judgment eroded, and survival came not from planning, but from sheer, bitter endurance. There was no storm, no great catastrophe, just a ship too weak, a plan too bold, and a group of men pulled into a place that doesn't forgive mistakes. What began as a mission of science ended in silence, scattered across frozen land and lost beneath black ice. And while the Arctic has long since sealed its surface, the shadows of that winter remain suspended in the cold, waiting just beneath the frost. The mystery of Ludwig Leihart. His disappearance was all the more baffling. considering he had already covered thousands of miles across the continent. A Prussian-born explorer with a background in science, he arrived in Australia in 1842 with almost no money, no reputation, and no connections. But within just a few years, he had become one of the most talked-about figures in colonial exploration. His success in leading a 3,000-mile journey from Moreton Bay to Port Essinisht, both scientists and settlers. It made him a national hero and gave him the confidence to attempt something far more dangerous. With careful planning and high hopes, Leichhardt set off from Queensland's Darling Downs in March 1848, accompanied by 7 men, dozens of animals, and months' worth of provision. His goal was ambitious: to cross the vast, unmapped interior of Australia from east to west, travelling to the Swan River settlement in what is now Perth. No one had ever done it. In fact, most believed it couldn't be done. The land between was barely understood, marked by long droughts, extreme heat, and almost no known sources of water. In those days, crossing such an interior was less a matter of endurance, and more a wager against the unknown, where maps showed little more than pale blankness, and the margins carried ominous notes from earlier explorers. Waterless country, impossible range, or sometimes only a question mark. The few who had ventured even part-way into this uncharted heart spoke of salt-crusted plains where the ground shimmered as if it were aflame, and of dust storms that could strip the moisture from a man's lips before he had time to swallow. Yet, like determination, seemed immune to such warnings. His letters before departure hinted at a belief, perhaps even a need, to prove that the continent could be crossed if one combined science with discipline, and that a rational mind could tame even a land as vast and brutal as Australia's interior.
Nothing was heard from the group again.
Unlike some expeditions that leave a trail of clues, the disappearance of Leichhardt's party was nearly total. No letters reached the coast, no messengers were sent back. The months passed, and then the years with no word. The silence grew heavy. Newspapers speculated governments organized search parties and reward money was offered. Still, not a single member of the expedition returned. Eventually, all official efforts to locate the party were abandoned, but the legend of Leichhardt only grew. His journals from earlier journeys had revealed a man of determination, intelligence, and calm under pressure. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't unprepared, which made the sudden and complete disappearance even harder to accept. Some believed they had perished in the desert, swallowed by thirst and distance. Others thought the group had been attacked, ambushed by hostile tribes, or even betrayed from within. A few believed Leichhardt might have survived for a time, living in isolation somewhere deep in the outback, unable or unwilling to return. The theories multiplied over decades, but none could be proven. Fragments did begin to surface, though always far too late. In 1874, nearly 30 years after the disappearance, a brass plate was found nailed to a tree near the Stir Creek area, thousands of kilometers from where Leichhardt had last been seen. It was inscribed with his name and the year 1848. Skeptics called it a hoax, but the evidence was enough to renew interest. Later, Aboriginal accounts surfaced, passed down through oral tradition, describing a group of white men traveling through remote regions around the same time, then disappearing one by one. These accounts often came wrapped in the cadence of campfire storytelling, where each retelling blurred the edges of truth and memory. Some described the strangers as weary but resolute, their clothing tattered, their boots patched with whatever scraps they could find. Others spoke of men so gaunt their shadows looked thicker than their bodies, pressing on through a country where even the birds refused to fly. In some versions, the group dwindled not through violence, but through slow surrender. One man left behind at a waterhole that had long since dried, another too weak to rise after the morning frost. And in at least one telling, the last survivor walked alone under a moonlit sky, heading toward a range that the locals called a place of no return. Whether these were fragments of real memory or stories woven from the absence of answers. They carried the same uneasy weight, a sense that the land itself had watched them go and simply decided not to give them back. In the 20th century, more artifacts emerged. A marked firearm, bits of equipment, and iron tent pegs, all found in locations so remote they raised more questions than answers. These objects suggested the expedition had made it far deeper into the interior than anyone had expected. But without human remains or written records, the final fate of Leichhardt and his men remained beyond reach. No one ever uncovered the full route they took, and no map was ever recovered from the journey. His field notebooks, which would have documented every creek, treine, and mountain range, were never found. The land, it seems, had swallowed them whole. There is a stillness in the Australian outback that offers no explanations, just dry wind, shifting sand, and stories that travel farther than the people who made them. What sets this mystery apart is not only the total disappearance, but the fact that so many people searched for so long and found so little. Leichhardt's reputation as a cautious, well-prepared explorer makes the absence of evidence feel unnatural. He left behind no chaos, no wreckage, no graves, only the outline of a plan and the faint trace of a dream that vanished into the interior. To this day, his name is carved into trees, sketched onto maps, and etched into stone markers across the Australian frontier. But the man himself was never seen again. Whatever route he took and whatever end he met, it happened out of view, beyond the last landmark in a part of the continent that never gave him back. The desert does not often answer, and in the case of Ludwig Leichhardt has remained silent for more than 175 years. The disappearance of the Nongesa Kohi flight. Early in the morning on May 8, 1927, two men climbed into a white biplane named L'Oiseau Blanc, the White Bird, and pointed its nose toward the sky above Paris. Charles Nangesa and François Key had one goal: to cross the Atlantic Ocean non-stop and land in New York. If they succeeded, they would beat Charles Lindbergh to the title of first non-stop transatlantic flight from Europe to America. The plane was light, stripped of everything except what was needed to survive the long flight. There was no radio, no parachutes, only fuel, determination, and the sky ahead. The aircraft lifted off from La Bourge Field and disappeared into the west. Witnesses along the French coast spotted the plane flying low, but steadily. It passed over the English Channel across southern England, then turned out toward the vast stretch of the Atlantic. For a while, reports trickled in. A fishing boat saw a white aircraft far out to sea. A ship's crew claimed they heard the drone of an engine cutting through the clouds. Then the silence began. For those following the flight's progress, that silence would have been almost physical, a hollow where the sound of the engine should have been. In 1927, the ocean was still a vast, indifferent expanse. No satellites, no radar sweeps, no transponders to mark a plane's last location. If you vanished out there, you didn't just disappear, you were erased from the record entirely. Ships passing through might look up at an empty sky, never knowing that somewhere above the clouds or below the waves, two men's lives were balanced on the edge of endurance. For Nungasa and Kohi, that danger was only heightened by the very design of their aircraft. L'Oiseau Blanc's floats made her seaworthy in theory, but they also dragged against headwinds, slowing her progress, consuming fuel at a rate no one could precisely measure once she left land behind. Somewhere in that boundless blue, a moment must have come when they knew the balance had tipped, when the math no longer worked, and the question was no longer if they would make it, but where they would fall. Nothing more was heard, and no crash was reported.
No wreckage was even recovered, and no flares lit up the horizon.
Nungesa and Kohi had vanished completely, somewhere between the coast of Ireland and the shores of North America. And because they had no radio, there would be no final message, no plea for help. The only thing left behind was a question that's never been answered.
How far did they actually get?
Rumors and theories swirled for decades, each one trying to fill in the silence left behind. Some believed they had run out of fuel and crashed into the sea. Others suggested they may have made it to the American coast, only to go down in fog or forest. A few early reports in New England claimed to have heard a low-flying plane over Maine around the time Lazo Blanc would have arrived. One man near Marquess claimed to have heard an explosion in the woods, followed by silence. But no crash site was ever found. What deepened the mystery was the complete lack of debris. Planes that crash into the ocean often leave behind something. Floating fuel tanks, torn fabric, splintered wood. Yet Lazo Blanc, with its 3,800 dmi of range and distinctive design, vanished without a trace. Even Lindbergh, who completed his own solo transatlantic flight just 2 weeks later, acknowledged their courage. In many ways, they had attempted the harder crossing, flying into prevailing headwinds, carrying no modern instruments in a heavier twin-flat aircraft. Over time, amateur investigators began to piece together alternative theories. Some focused on Newfoundland, where locals claimed to have seen a white aircraft circle above the trees before disappearing inland. In the 1980s, an American group led several expeditions into the forest of Maine and Canada, looking for signs of an old crash. Metal fragments were found, but none could be definitively linked to the plane. One rusted engine mount looked promising until it was traced to a logging plane, lost decades later. The lack of conclusive evidence allowed the legend to grow. It also made the search for truth strangely personal. For decades, locals in Maine and Newfoundland passed on fragments of memory as if each might be the missing puzzle piece. A strange engine's buzz over a quiet harbor, an unfamiliar wing shape glinting against the clouds, a sound like tearing canvas deep in the forest. For some, the white bird became less an aircraft than a ghost, something glimpsed briefly in the corner of the eye before vanishing again into fog. The searchers who pushed into those northern woods often spoke of an uncanny stillness, as if the landscape itself were reluctant to give up what it knew. Even the metal fragments that turned out to be from other planes seemed to carry
a hint of the story they were chasing.
In a place where snow can bury a crash site for decades and trees grow over wreckage until it becomes part of the soil, it was easy to believe that the white bird might still be there, its frame rusting quietly, its final moments locked away beneath layers of moss and time. Nonguessa was a national hero in France, one of the top fighter races of World War I, known for flying a black-decorated aircraft with skulls and lightning bolts. Collie had once lost an eye in a crash and returned to flying within months. Together, they represented a bold, romantic era of aviation when risk was the cost of progress and maps were still filled with blanks. Their flight, though brief, was meticulously planned. They had calculated fuel consumption by the hour. Their chosen path was a great circle route aimed directly across the Atlantic into the northeastern United States. Had they deviated even slightly, they could have ended up over unbroken forest or gone down in rough seas without ever being spotted. It's possible they were just minutes from success. Every few years, someone announces a new search, a sonar reading, a story passed down through the family. A potential eyewitness revisits a memory from childhood, yet the trail always fades. The white bird remains one of the most elusive missing aircraft in history. An early leap into the sky that never landed. What became of Nungesser and Coley is unknown. But for nearly a century, their empty flight path has remained suspended between continents, a line across the sea that ends in silence. Somewhere beneath waves or buried beneath pine and snow, the answer may still be waiting. But the Atlantic keeps its secrets well. The unfinished climb of Thomas Olivares. The name Thomas Oliver wasn't known far beyond Chile until he disappeared. He wasn't a professional mountaineer or a sponsored athlete, just a quiet climber with a love for the Andes and a history of solo ascents that few people ever heard about. In January 1993, he set out alone to summit El Pomo, a 17,800 FT peak looming above Santiago. It wasn't his first time on the mountain. He had climbed it before, but this time he planned a new route, a more difficult line over less charted ridges. He never came back. Everything pointed to a quiet night, no sign of the chaos that was coming. The weather had been unusually clear for several days, with only mild winds reported near the summit. Friends said he was in good shape. His gear was solid, his pack carefully organized. A few shepherds saw him early on the second day, high on the glacier, making steady progress. Then, as the light faded and the temperature dropped, the mountains swallowed him. Far from the city lights, the upper ridges of El Pomo are a realm where sound vanishes and even the wind seems cautious. And in that unnatural stillness, any misstep can feel amplified into eternity. Climbers who have traversed those isolated shelves of ice describe a strange sense of being watched, not by people, but by the mountain itself, as if the stone and snow are quietly taking inventory of who enters and who leaves. It is here, in this unmarked zone of solitude, that Olivares was last seen. And beyond this point, no trace of him has ever been verified. Days passed before anyone realized something was wrong. Olivares had told a few people about the route. He wasn't expected back on a fixed date, so no alarm was raised right away. When search teams were finally organized, they found his base camp untouched, the tent still pitched, food and supplies waiting. But there were no signs of struggle, no scattered gear, and no footprints leading out. Whatever had happened to him had occurred high above. Helicopters were sent in. Climbers traced possible routes. The snow had frozen solid in the night since his disappearance, making it impossible to tell where he might have fallen. There were cliffs, hidden creases, sheer ice slopes where a slip could send someone hundreds of feet down without leaving a mark. But every lead ended the same way, in nothing. From above, the route he was believed to have taken looks deceptively simple. Yet the glacier hides more hazards than the casual eye can see. Beneath the glittering crust lie pockets of air big enough to swallow a man whole. Their entrances concealed under a thin shell of snow that gives way without warning. Veterans of the Andes speak of these voids in hushed tones, recalling how the light within them turns an unnatural blue, the last thing a trapped climber might ever see before the cold overtakes him. If Oliver S. had slipped into one of these hidden chambers, the glacier would have sealed the opening within hours, erasing the only witness. Rescue teams searched the upper glacier and Argel lines for nearly 2 weeks. Not a single item belonging to Olivares was found. No rope, no broken crampons, no clothing. His name was added to the long list of climbers lost in the Andes, but something about the silence surrounding his case lingered. There had been no storm, no avalanche, no obvious cause, only a man with experience, equipment, and purpose who seemed to vanish into the clear air. What followed were rumors. Small, strange details passed between locals and mountaineers. One said that weeks later, a climber saw something shine in a rock chute near the summit, but it was too dangerous to reach. Another spoke of an empty boot spotted wedged into ice far below the glacier's edge. Nothing was ever confirmed. The mountain kept everything. Quiet efforts persisted in the following years, with people continuing to look unofficially and often at great personal risk. Climbers on El Pomo would sometimes veer off course just to scan ridges or scout crevasses where they might have fallen. One man carried a laminated photo of Olivares in his pack, hoping someone might recognize his face or remember a detail that had been missed. But there were no breakthroughs, only more questions scattered like snow across an impossible slope. Some theories tried to make sense of his choice. They suggested that Olivares had been chasing something, perhaps a personal record or even the faint outlines of Incan ruins rumored to exist on the higher ridges. After all, El Pomo is known for its preserved child mummy found near the summit, evidence of ancient ritual climbs. but no diary entries or final letters were ever recovered. If he was chasing a mystery, it died with him. Legends tied to El Pomo's summit add a darker layer to his disappearance. For the mountain has long been a place where ancient paths cross the modern world in uneasy silence.
Local lore whispers of Camino de los Spiritus, spirit roads,
Hidden routes used in centuries past by Inca messengers and ritual processions. Some of these paths are said to veer into places no living person should walk, where strange echoes travel against the wind and where the air tastes faintly of metal. Whether Oliver has sought these routes intentionally or stumbled upon them by accident remains unknown, but the possibility lingers in conversations among those who climb there still. A single slip could have been enough. The terrain made the threat of a sudden fall all too real.
One hidden weakness in the ice, one misstep, and that was it.
A slip on black rock warmed just enough by the sun to melt beneath his boots.
Accidents like that can happen in seconds.
But even in those cases, some sign is usually left behind: a glove, a torn strap, a trail broken halfway through. In Olivares' case, nothing. On rare, warm days, some climbers report a low, groaning sound as if the glacier itself remembers. The ice groans hollow and deep, like something moving below the surface. Some wonder if his body is buried there, perfectly preserved in the frozen dark, drifting inch by inch down the slope with the slow crawl of time.
No official memorial marks the place where he vanished.
There is only the wind, the snow, and the quiet face of the mountain he never finished climbing. Thomas Olivares is still up there somewhere, unfound, unturned, and unexplained. The fatal dive of the Aegean explorer. In the summer of 1991, a small research vessel named the Aegean Explorer left the port of Piraeus, Greece, and quietly disappeared into the deep. It had been outfitted for a specialized mission. A dive team searching for sunken ruins off the coast of Antitha, where ancient wrecks had been found before. The team was small: 3 divers, a captain, and 1 marine archaeologist. They had permits, equipment, and weeks of preparation behind them. According to their last radio transmission, they expected to return to port in 3 days. By all accounts, the first part of the mission went according to plan. The vessel anchored near a steep underwater shelf known for strong currents and poor visibility. Using a combination of sonar and dive reels, the team mapped several promising sites during this initial descent. One diver later recorded in the logbook that they had seen outlines of worked stone nearly 150 ft below the surface, suggesting structures, not shipwrecks. Divers who know the anti-shelf often speak of the unsettling quiet that settles in once you pass below the first thermocline. It is not the ordinary hush of being underwater, but a heavier, almost oppressive stillness, as though the sea is holding its breath. In that dim half-light, shapes become fluid, distances deceptive, outlines can seem to shift when glanced at from the corner of the eye, stone edges melting into shadow before reforming again. It was here, in this muted landscape of sand and ruin, that the crew of the Aegean Explorer believed they had found something that did not belong to any charted history. The entry was dated July 14th. It was the last thing anyone ever wrote. The following day, radio contact with the Aegean Explorer stopped. No distress signal was sent. No weather systems had passed through the area. When port authorities failed to reach them after 24 hours, a search was launched. Aircraft were sent over the island chain. Boats combed the waters between Antitha and Sit. Nothing surfaced. The ship had vanished entirely, with no oil slick, no debris, no life raft. What puzzled investigators from the beginning was the calmness of the sea. That stretch of the Mediterranean had been quiet, with barely a ripple strong enough to move a buoy. Satellite images showed no sudden storms. Local fishermen reported nothing unusual, and yet an entire vessel with experienced divers and a support crew had disappeared in broad daylight. When the search shifted underwater, divers found it difficult to pinpoint the area the team had been exploring. Records on shore were vague. The ship's manifest had been logged correctly, but the dive coordinates listed in the project file led nowhere. For weeks, Greek Navy divers combed the seabed. Only one piece of equipment was ever recovered. A weighted guideline snapped at one end, discovered tangled in coral about 200 ft below. The rope was dated to the type used by the Unexplorer, but even that couldn't be confirmed beyond doubt. Navy divers also noted that their depth gauges briefly malfunctioned in that same sector, giving inconsistent readings despite calm conditions. One recovery log mentioned a faint rhythmic vibration in the water,
strong enough to rattle metal clips on the dive gear before abruptly stopping.
The coral itself told its own story, ancient, slow-growing, and undisturbed for decades. To find a freshly frayed rope embedded in it suggested not just the violence of a break, but the precision of a moment when everything went wrong at once. Experienced divers speculated that such a snap could only come from a sudden pull, as though the guideline had been dragged sharply downward, deeper than the rope had been designed to reach. Theories ranged from a collapsing section of seabed to something more deliberate, a force moving with intention beneath the divers' feet. Yet, no gouges, no dislodged silt clouds, no signs of collapse were ever documented in the follow-up dives.
Rumors began to circulate, as they often do when nothing makes sense.
Some claimed the team had discovered a secret chamber beneath the seabed connected to the same ancient wreck that produced the Antither mechanism decades earlier. Others believed they had stumbled onto a military dumping ground and had been silenced. The strangest theory came from a local diver who said he'd seen lights underwater the night the team vanished, pulsing faintly from the deep as if something had opened and closed far below the surface. Adding to the confusion, one anonymous fax arrived at the Maritime Archaeology Department in Athens 6 days after the disappearance. It contained a rough sketch of what looked like submerged columns marked with the initials AE in the corner. The sender was never identified. No handwriting matched the crew. The phone number on the cover sheet led to a disconnected line in Thessaloniki. All these years later, not a single piece of wreckage has been found. The ship's emergency beacon never activated. Family members of the crew have pushed for a deeper investigation, including new sonar mapping of the surrounding seafloor. But so far, nothing conclusive has emerged. It's as though the ocean quietly erased them, pulling ship, equipment, and memory into a trench that wasn't on any official chart. Unlike many lost vessels, the Unexplorer wasn't operating in stormy seas or high-risk waters. It was a routine dive, one of dozens carried out in the area over the years. But something about that descent, something beneath the Silton current, refused to let go.
Nothing has been built to remember them. The spot where they launched is just another stretch of wooden salt.
Just a faded photo of the crew pinned to a bulletin board in a local dive shop, yellowing under glass. And each year, as summer returns, a few still remember the quiet research vessel that went out for ruins and returned as a legend. Whatever the Aegean explorer found on the seafloor, it took the answer with it. And the Aegean, ancient and silent, has never offered it back. The madness of the Gley expedition. When Lieutenant Adulis Greely set sail in 1881, he carried with him the hopes of American science and Arctic ambition. His expedition, made up of 25 men, was tasked with establishing a meteorological outpost at Lady Franklin Bay, high in the frozen reaches of northern Canada. Their mission was part of the first International Polar Year, a global effort to collect data in some of Earth's harshest environments. Gley's team was well-equipped, disciplined, and determined. What followed was not a scientific triumph, but one of the bleakest tales in polar history. Their base was constructed near the edge of the Arctic Ocean, where temperatures regularly plunged below 40 degrees. The first year passed without incident.
Observations were recorded.
Supplies lasted. Morale held, but the Arctic is not kind for long. Resupply ships promised each summer never reached them. One was turned back by ice, another sank before getting close as months passed with no contact. The optimism that had once filled their logbooks began to thin out like the light in the sky. As the second winter set in, supplies had already dwindled to dangerously low levels. Gley decided to abandon the station in 1883, moving his men south in search of help. They traveled by sled and boat down the frozen coast, eventually reaching Cape Sabine. There, with no fuel, little food, and no shelter beyond makeshift tents, they waited day after day, then week after week, for rescue that never came. Along the ragged shoreline, the sea ice shifted and groaned like some vast, restless creature, opening cracks that revealed black water before sealing them again in the same hour. The men scavenged the beach for anything edible, turning over stones for limpets or seaweed, and even setting traps for Arctic foxes that never appeared. Each failed attempt to find food seemed to weigh heavier than the hunger itself, for it stripped away the last illusion that survival might be within their control. Nights brought not only the bite of the cold, but a sound that some described as a faint hollow knocking from deep within the ice, as if the land itself were echoing their desperation. The suffering was immediate. They burned everything that would catch fire. They chewed boot leather to stay alive.
Frostbite blackened limbs, hunger-stripped muscle.
At night, the wind shrieked against the canvas, and by morning, another man wouldn't wake up. Still, Gley insisted on discipline. He kept a strict routine. Ration logs were updated, even when there was nothing left to count. But starvation has a way of hollowing out both body and mind. Disorder crept in. One man was caught stealing food, and under Gley's orders was executed by gunshot, a grim attempt to preserve control as the group fell apart. Others, driven by madness or despair, wandered off into the snow. One was found kneeling beside a rock, hands frozen to the ground as if praying. Another carved strange symbols into a tent pole, muttering to himself until his voice gave out. Stories of cannibalism began to surface, whispers that some of the bodies weren't just buried, but opened. Rumors among the survivors hinted at strange rituals born not from faith, but from delirium. Men circling the tents in the dead of night, whispering lists of names as though taking attendance for the dead. The camp's journal, later recovered, contained pages smeared and torn, where ink lines wandered into the margins in spirals and shapes that matched no written language. Gley, though still committed to order, must have seen the fraying of reason. Some entries were struck through so forcefully the paper tore, leaving ragged holes where sentences had been erased from history. Out of the 25 who had set out, only 7 remained when rescuers found them in June of 1884. All were emaciated, silent, their eyes sunken and unfocused. The camp was scattered with the remains of those who hadn't made it. Some lay carefully in the snow, others half hidden beneath tarps, their flesh disturbed in ways no animal could have done. A diary was found in a tin box, its final entries noting the death of the surgeon, the cook, and the mechanic. The pages ended with the words, "We wait." The world recoiled at the news, while Gley and the other survivors were treated as heroes in official reports. The rumors of what had happened at Cape Sign refused to die. A formal investigation cleared them of wrongdoing, but behind closed doors, questions remained. How far had they gone to survive? How much of what they endured could even be described? Rescuers would later note the peculiar arrangement of the dead, some placed with hands crossed over their chests, others curled as if in sleep, and a few left in positions so unnatural they seemed frozen in mid-movement. Personal effects were found clutched tightly in stiff hands. A pipe filled with frozen tobacco, a small compass, a scrap of cloth embroidered with initials no one recognized. These fragments, meaningless on their own, became symbols of a mystery that no testimony could fully explain, as though the camp had been gripped not only by starvation, but by an unspoken final understanding among the last to remain. It wasn't just the physical toll that unsettled people, it was the idea that civilization, so carefully maintained through ranks and routines, had unraveled so quickly in the cold that men who had once sat together recording barometric pressure could end up watching one another die day after day without rescue or reason. The Arctic had not just frozen them, it had stripped them of the thin layers that made them men. Photographs taken after their return show hollow faces behind thick beards, too gaunt to smile. Glade lived for decades afterward, writing papers and giving speeches, but he rarely spoke in detail about what happened during that final winter. When pressed, he simply said, "We did what we had to do." Cape Sabine bears no memorial, no plaque, no stone, nothing to remember them by. Just broken ice, wind-blasted rocks, and the echoes of voices lost in snow. The science was recorded. The coordinates are logged, but the human cost of the Glide expedition remains buried under frost and silence, its full story sealed away by hunger, madness, and the cold indifference of the Arctic. The vanishing of Flight 19. The skies over Florida were clear when the 5 bombers took off. It was December 5th, 1945, just months after the end of World War II, and the US Navy was running routine training missions out of Fort Lauderdale. The flight, known as Flight 19, consisted of 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers and 14 men. They were scheduled to fly a triangle pattern over the Atlantic, out east, up the coast, and back to base. It was a familiar route for experienced pilots, one they'd flown many times before. What began as standard navigation practice quickly fell apart. Roughly 90 minutes into the flight, radio transmissions between pilots and flight control grew erratic. The flight leader, Lieutenant Charles Taylor, reported that his compasses were malfunctioning and he was unsure of their position. The other pilots followed his lead despite expressing doubts about the direction they were heading. The radio crackled with static, but snippets of conversation slipped through. Some calm, others panicked. "We seem to be off course," one voice said. "Everything looks strange, even the ocean." Attempts to redirect the flight back to land failed. Taylor insisted they were over the Florida Keys, but radar showed otherwise. In truth, they had drifted far northeast, deep into the open ocean. As fuel ran low, the pilots' voices grew more desperate. The last message came just after 6 p.m. All planes close up tight. We'll have to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together. Then the sky went silent. A massive search began almost immediately. Within hours, the Navy launched a Martin Mariner rescue plane with a crew of 13. But less than 30 minutes after takeoff, that aircraft also vanished. A nearby tanker reported seeing an explosion in the air and a trail of burning oil on the sea. No trace of the rescue plane or Flight 19 was ever found. What lingers most about the incident isn't the death toll, but the eerie silence left behind. No wreckage, no trace. Hundreds of ships and aircraft scoured the Atlantic for days. Sonar teams swept the seafloor. Not a single piece of debris from the 5 Avengers or the missing rescue plane ever surfaced. The official Navy report offered no definitive conclusion, suggesting that Taylor may have become disoriented and led his squadron into deep water. But even that didn't explain the lack of remains. The mystery deepened when investigators reviewed the training flight's transcript. Several crew members had questioned Taylor's judgment mid-air. One was heard suggesting they fly west toward the setting sun, which would have led them back to land, but the flight stuck together and followed orders, trusting their commander even as he doubted his own instruments. It wasn't only poor navigation. It was confusion layered with trust unfolding in real time over open water. Beneath the waves that day, ocean currents were running unusually strong, a detail noted in meteorological records but not widely discussed in public accounts. These shifting currents could have pushed any wreckage far from the flight path, scattering pieces across hundreds of miles in unpredictable patterns. That factor alone complicated the search, forcing Navy vessels to sweep an area far larger than initially planned, while strong winter tides carried away whatever clues the sea might have been willing to surrender. Eyewitness reports from fishing boats in the region added another layer of intrigue. Several crews swore they saw low-flying aircraft pass overhead, not long before the disappearance, but their descriptions of direction and formation didn't align with the Navy's official reconstruction of the flight path. Some even claimed the planes were flying unusually close together, as if trying to maintain visual contact in worsening visibility, though weather reports for that specific zone suggested skies were still relatively clear. Archival search and rescue logs mention a troubling anomaly involving radio beacons. Standard protocol at the time required that rescue planes and ships home in on distress signals sent by downed aircraft, yet not a single signal was ever picked up from Flight 19. This absence puzzled investigators because even if the planes had ditched into the ocean intact, their emergency transmitters should have continued broadcasting for several hours before water damage silenced them. Technical assessments conducted years later explored another possibility that the Avenger's carburetor heaters had malfunctioned, causing gradual engine failure in cold, high-altitude air. It was a theory never fully proven, but one that could explain the squadron's steady loss of altitude in the final minutes without an immediate catastrophic event. If this were the case, the end would have been slow, inevitable, and tragically silent. Conspiracy theories quickly took root. Some pointed to the so-called Bermuda Triangle, that stretch of ocean known for unexplained disappearances. Others claimed secret military tests had interfered with navigation equipment. A few even suggested the planes had crossed into another dimension. None of these ideas were ever proven. What remained was an uncomfortable reality. 6 aircraft, 27 men, and 0 answers. Decades passed and bits of wreckage from other planes were sometimes recovered in the area. Each time hopes rose that Flight 19 had finally been found, but serial numbers never matched. Even deep-sea scans of suspected crash sites yielded nothing definitive. The ocean, as always, kept its secrets. The official Navy conclusion was revised years later to state that the planes were lost at sea for unknown reasons. It was the most honest assessment they could give. Technology has advanced, and yet no clearer picture of what happened that day has emerged. Some believe the planes ran out of fuel and went down in bad weather. Others hold fast to more unearthly explanations. The facts, however, are simple. 5 planes took off and none returned. In Fort Lauderdale today, a memorial stands bearing the names of those lost with Flight 19. The inscription reads, "They vanished over the Atlantic. The sea kept its secret." And still, when pilots fly over that patch of ocean, they often glance at their instruments just a little more carefully. There's something about that stretch of sky and sea that refuses to give anything back. The final descent of Steve Fawcett. Steve Fawcett wasn't a man who vanished easily. By 2007, he was known across the world for breaking aviation and endurance records that most people wouldn't even dare to attempt. He had flown solo around the globe in a hot air balloon, piloted gliders to altitudes higher than commercial jets, and driven race cars across salt flats. He was a millionaire, an adventurer, and a pilot with over 100 world records to his name. So, when he took off on a short solo flight over the Nevada desert on September 3rd, no one expected it would be the last time anyone saw him alive. The flight wasn't meant to be dangerous. Fawcett had borrowed a small, single-engine Bellanca Super Decathlon from a friend planning to scout for dry lake beds that could serve as future testing grounds for a land speed project. He didn't file a flight plan, something not required for clear weather daytime flying, and told no one the exact route he intended to take. With skies clear and visibility high, he lifted off from a private airstrip near Yarrington, Nevada, and disappeared into the empty air. When he failed to return that evening, the search began. It quickly grew into one of the most extensive aerial searches in US history. Dozens of aircraft combed hundreds of square miles. Satellite imaging companies were called in. Even Google Earth users around the world joined in, poring over map data for signs of a crash site. But despite thousands of hours of flight time and massive resources, there was nothing. No wreckage, no signal, no trail. The scale of the disappearance baffled both experts and the public. Fawcett had an emergency beacon, but no distress call was ever received. The terrain he flew over was rough but not impenetrable. High desert, rocky ridges and isolated valleys, but nothing that should have swallowed a plane without leaving clues. What the initial reports didn't emphasize was just how many search variables worked against rescuers from the start. September heat waves in the Nevada desert can trigger shimmering thermal mirages, making it harder for pilots to distinguish wreckage from rock outcroppings. Afternoon winds often whip through narrow canyons, blowing lightweight debris into places no one would think to look. In some stretches, the pale rust of the soil nearly matched the orange and white paint of the Balanca, camouflaging it from even low-altitude sweeps. The rugged borderlands between Nevada and California added another challenge:
radar blind spots.
Once Fawcett's plane dipped behind certain ridges, tracking became impossible, leaving only rough guesses about his heading. The absence of a filed flight plan meant there was no baseline search grid. Every hour that passed widened the radius until the area to be covered became nearly the size of a small state. For search crews, it was like chasing a shadow in a landscape built to hide it. Speculation spiraled quickly. Some wondered if he'd staged his own disappearance. Others thought he might have been flying toward a secret project, something worth hiding. The longer the search stretched on, the more far-fetched the theories became. Yet, behind the rumors was a man with a deep respect for risk and a strong connection to reality. Those who knew Fawcett said he wouldn't vanish on purpose. He was disciplined, methodical, and well aware of the dangers he faced. But even with those qualities, the desert doesn't always give people back. For over a year, the mystery remained sealed. Then, in September 2008, 13 months after the disappearance, a hiker named Preston Morrow came across a tattered aviation license and a handful of $100 bills lodged beneath a bush near Mammoth Lakes, California. The name on the permit, Steve Fawcett. Search crews returned to the area and eventually found the wreckage of the plane scattered across a steep mountain slope. It had crashed just 300 ft below the summit of a ridge, leaving a debris field hidden by tree cover. An investigation concluded that Fawcett likely encountered a sudden downdraft, a pocket of fast-moving air that forced the plane downward faster than it could climb. At high altitudes in mountainous terrain, even an experienced pilot can be caught off guard. The impact had been immediate. He would have had no time to call for help.
Even with the case technically closed, something about the story still felt unfinished.
For so long, his disappearance had been wrapped in silence. No one could believe a man so well prepared could simply vanish into thin air. And for over a year, that's exactly what happened. People looked everywhere except the one place where he'd gone down. So close to populated areas, yet so well hidden that not even high-tech surveillance could find him. The desert, like the sea, has a way of erasing trails, and in Fawcett's case, it waited more than a year before giving up even the smallest answer. What remained of his plane was little more than twisted aluminum and scorched branches. Of the man himself, only fragments were recovered, buried in the high brush of the Sierra Nevada. There is no great mystery to how he died. However, the long stretch of silence between flight and discovery, along with the fruitless searches that led nowhere, has kept this story alive. Fawcett didn't disappear in the middle of a storm. He wasn't flying over an ocean. He left under blue skies, and still for a long time, no one could find him. The lost R-74 French airship disaster.
The R-7004
was the pride of French aviation in the early 1930s, a massive silver airship designed to carry passengers across long distances. with a level of comfort that rivaled the grand
ocean liners of its day, at a time when air travel still felt like stepping into the future.
The R7004 represented speed, ambition, and national pride. Built with the latest engineering techniques and fitted with powerful engines, it was meant to prove that France could dominate the skies. Its maiden voyages went smoothly, drawing crowds at every stop. Newspapers hailed it as the new face of travel, a floating hotel suspended in the air. But one summer in 1930, during what should have been a routine flight over the Mediterranean, the R7004 vanished in a way that left investigators with nothing but fragments of a story and questions that would never be fully answered. The airship departed from Toulon on a warm July morning, bound for Ailers. On board were a mix of crew members and passengers, some on business, others simply looking to experience the novelty of crossing the sea in a vessel that glided far above the waves. Captain Louis Dell, a decorated airship pilot, had taken the helm. The weather at departure was clear, and forecast predicted only light winds along the route. The R7004 rose smoothly into the sky, its hull gleaming in the sunlight. Early reports from the crew to ground stations confirmed everything was proceeding as expected. Several hours into the journey, at around midday, the radio operator in Toulon received a brief message from the R7004. The words were routine. A position update, confirmation of course, nothing out of the ordinary. But less than an hour later, a second transmission came through. This time, the operator's voice was strained, clipped, as if struggling to focus. The message mentioned unexpected turbulence and then cut off mid-sentence. Attempts to re-establish contact failed. Other radio stations along the route also tried to reach the airship, but there was no reply. Witnesses along the coast claimed they saw the R7004 that afternoon, but their descriptions were troubling. One fisherman near Sardinia swore the airship was listing slightly to one side, moving slower than usual. He thought he saw smoke trailing from one of the engine pods, though the haze of the day made it hard to be certain. Another account came from a merchant vessel whose crew reported the R7004 drifting lower than expected, almost skimming the tops of the clouds. These sightings were never officially confirmed, but they painted a picture of a ship that might have been in silent distress. When the R7004 failed to arrive in Ailers at the scheduled time, the French Navy launched a search. Ships and planes fanned out across the Mediterranean, scanning the water for debris. For 2 days, nothing surfaced. No wreckage, no oil slick, no trace of the massive airship. It was as if the R7004 had been lifted from the sky and erased. Then on the third day, a small fishing vessel out of Corsica spotted something in the water. It was a section of torn aluminum twisted and scorched. A serial number confirmed it was part of the R7004's outer hull. Nearby, search teams recovered a lifebelt and a charred fragment of fabric that had once been part of the airship's gas envelope. The condition of the debris suggested a violent end. Investigators debated whether lightning could have struck the ship, igniting the hydrogen that kept it aloft. Others pointed to the possibility of a mechanical failure in one of the engines, which could have led to a fire. Yet there were problems with both theorists. The weather on that day had been calm, with no thunderstorms reported along the R7004's flight path, and the engines had been inspected just before departure, with no sign of trouble. The most unsettling possibility, though rarely spoken of officially, was sabotage. In the tense political climate of the early 1930s, acts of political violence were not unheard of, and the R7004, as a symbol of French prestige, could have been a target. No bodies were ever recovered despite weeks of searching. The Mediterranean has a way of keeping its secrets, swallowing wrecks and scattering their remains beyond reach. Families of the passengers clung to the hope that perhaps a lifeboat had made it to shore, but no survivors ever came forward. In Toulon, the empty mooring tower stood as a reminder of what had been lost, its cables swaying in the wind. Newspapers that had once praised the R-74 now ran headlines filled with speculation. Some claimed the ship had exploded in mid-air, raining debris into the sea. Others whispered about strange lights seen over the water on the night of the disappearance. Stories that blurred the line between fact and rumor. In the months that followed, French authorities conducted a full inquiry. They interviewed mechanics, radio operators, and weather officers, piecing together a timeline that ended abruptly with that final broken radio transmission. The official report concluded that the R-7004 had likely suffered a sudden and catastrophic accident, but it stopped short of naming a cause. Too little evidence remained to draw firm conclusions. The fragments of Harland fabric were stored in a government archive where they remain to this day silent relics of an unanswered question. For the families of those lost, the lack of answers was the hardest part. Without a clear cause, there could be no closure. Captain Delhome's widow often visited the Toulon airfield, watching the other airships come and go, hoping against reason that one day the R-7004 might appear on the horizon. Crew members' names were added to a memorial plaque alongside others who had been lost in the early days of aviation. The plaque does not list how or why they died, only that they vanished in service of exploration. As the years passed, the R-7004 slipped into the realm of half-forgotten stories. Airship travel itself declined, replaced by faster and safer airplanes, and with it, the memory of that bright morning in 1930 faded from the public mind. Yet among aviation historians, the case still stirs curiosity. Theories continue to circulate, some grounded in engineering, others more speculative. Could a hydrogen leak have silently filled the hull before an unseen spark set it off? Was the airship struck by debris from above? Perhaps a meteor fragment in the endless open sky? Or did someone on board act with deliberate intent, sealing the face of everyone in the gondola beneath the great silver canopy? Whatever the truth, the R-7004's final journey remains one of the Mediterranean's most enduring mysteries. Somewhere beneath the waves lies the rest of the ship, its engines and cabins resting in the dark. Perhaps there are clues there, preserved in the silt, waiting for a day when technology can finally reach them. Until then, the R-7004 drifts through history much as it did on that last day, silent, unreachable, and forever just out of sight. The tragedy of the Jeannette Arctic voyage. In the late summer of 1879, the USS Jeannette set out from San Francisco with a bold purpose: to push through the Arctic ice and reach the North Pole by way of the Bering Strait. It was a dream fueled by the belief that a warm current flowed into the polar region, a theory that promised an open sea beyond the frozen barrier. Leading the voyage was Lieutenant George Washington Dong, a determined naval officer with a reputation for discipline and endurance. His crew numbered 33 men, including engineers, sailors, a doctor, and a newspaper correspondent to record their progress for the New York Herald. Spirits were high as the Jeannette steamed north. The American flag snapping in the wind against a sky that still held the long summer light. As they approached the Chukchi Sea, the world around them began to change. Days grew shorter, the sun lower, the wind sharper.
Ice appeared on the horizon.
At first, scattered floes drifting in the current, then thicker sheets that creaked against the ship's wooden hull. On September 6th, the Jeannette became trapped in a vise of ice that refused to loosen. The crew tried to free her with saws and poles, but the ice held firm. Winter set in and the ship became a frozen island in a silent white desert. The men adapted as best they could, building snow walls around the deck to keep out the wind and using the ship's stores to prepare warm meals. But they knew they were at the mercy of the drifting ice, which carried them ever farther from their intended route. The first winter passed without major disaster, though frostbite and illness gnawed at the crew. Dong kept morale through routine daily duties, navigation checks, and journal entries. Hunting parties were sent out across the ice to bring back seals or polar bears, which supplemented their dwindling rations. Still, there were signs that the ice was taking its toll on the Jeanette. Wooden beams groaned under the shifting pressure. Small leaks appeared in her hull, patched as best as the carpenter could manage in the freezing conditions. When the sun returned in spring, the view was only more ice in every direction, an unbroken expanse that made the ship's entrapment feel like a prison sentence. By the summer of 1881, the pressure on the hull had become relentless. Cracks ran along the deck planking, and the sound of splintering wood echoed below. On June 12th, the ice finally crushed the Jeanette beyond saving. The crew worked frantically to haul provisions, equipment, and 3 small boats onto the ice before the ship sank beneath the frozen surface. They now faced the impossible, a march over hundreds of miles of shifting floes toward the distant Siberian coast. Each man carried what he could, pulling sledges laden with food, tents, and the heavy boats that would eventually carry them through open water. Their journey was slow and punishing. The ice was uneven, broken by ridges that had to be climbed, and channels of frigid water forced them to dismantle loads and ferry them piece by piece. Some nights the floes shifted beneath them, opening cracks that swallowed gear before they could react. The Arctic showed no mercy. Temperatures plunged, storms blinded them, and the constant damp from melting snow soaked through clothing, leaving men shivering even inside their tents. Despite these hardships, Dong pushed forward, recording their progress in his log. His entries grew shorter and more desperate as days passed. In early September, the ice gave way to stretches of open water. The crew launched their boats and rowed for the Lena Delta, a vast and treacherous maze of rivers and marshes on the Siberian coast. The sea was rough, and the boats soon became separated in bad weather. Engineer George Melville commanded one boat which reached a small settlement and found help. Another boat under the ship's doctor, Edward Amler, never arrived at its destination and was presumed lost. Dong's own boat reached the delta, but the landing was just the beginning of a new ordeal. The Lena Delta in autumn was a place of mud, chill winds, and endless marshes. Dong and his remaining men tried to follow the riverbanks towards known settlements, but their supplies were almost gone. They survived on scraps of dried meat, occasional fish, and what few birds they could catch. Frostbite blackened fingers and toes, and exhaustion slowed their progress until they could barely drag themselves forward. Dong's journal from these days is a haunting record. Notes on the weather, on which men could no longer walk, and on the grim tally of those who died along the way. By late October, only a handful were left. Dong, too weak to continue, ordered 2 of his men to try to push ahead and find help. He remained behind with the others, huddled in makeshift shelters against the bitter wind. Weeks later, Melville, who had organized a rescue from the settlement he reached, found Dong's camp. The bodies lay where they had fallen, wrapped in blankets and ragged clothing. Beside Dong was his logbook, its final entry, a simple record of the date and temperature. No farewell, no final words beyond the steady noting of facts, as if clinging to duty until the very end. In all, 20 of Jeanette's 33 men perished in the Arctic. Those who survived carried the weight of the journey for the rest of their lives. The New York Herald published the story in harrowing detail, and the US Navy honored Dong and his crew for their bravery. The wreck of the Jeanette itself drifted in the Arctic ice for years before pieces were found far from where she sank, proof of the currents that had carried her even in death. The tragedy of the Jeanette was more than a tale of men lost to ice and cold. It revealed the terrible gap between the era's optimism and the reality of the polar wilderness. The Arctic was not an open sea waiting to be sailed, but a shifting, crushing world that demanded everything from those who entered it. And for Dong and his crew, it demanded more than they could give, leaving their story frozen in place. Another mystery held in the white silence. the mysterious end of the Laperoux expedition. When King Louis XVI of France approved the Laperoux expedition in 1785, it was meant to be one of the most ambitious voyages of exploration the world had ever seen. Two ships, the Boussole and the Astrolabe, were prepared for a journey that would circle the globe, chart unknown waters, and strengthen France's role in maritime discovery. Jean-François Gallo Comte de la Pérouse, a skilled and respected naval officer, was chosen to lead. His orders were clear: explore, record, and return with maps, reports, and scientific observations that would rival those of Captain James Cook. The preparations were meticulous, with astronomers, botanists, and skilled navigators among the crew, along with enough supplies to last for years at sea. The voyage began smoothly, with early legs bringing valuable discoveries. They sailed down the Atlantic, rounded Cape Horn, and visited the Pacific coast of South America before crossing to the distant shores of Alaska. From there, the expedition turned south, stopping at Easter Island, Hawaii, and various other Pacific islands, carefully mapping coastlines and recording details of local cultures. Reports sent back to France describe both the hardships and the successes, and the mission became a source of national pride. Lepe himself was known for his even temper, which helped keep order among the nearly 200 men who depended on each other in unfamiliar seas. Trouble first began when the ships reached the waters around Samoa in December 1787. The French had gone ashore at Mayuna, present-day Tutila, to trade and gather fresh food. But tensions flared. A misunderstanding turned violent, and in the chaos, 12 men were killed, including one of Laperouse's closest officers. The incident left the commander shaken but determined to complete his mission. He recorded the event in detail before setting sail again, heading for the friendly shores of Australia. By January 1788, both ships had anchored at Bot Bay, where the British First Fleet had just arrived to establish a penal colony. There, Laperouse met with Governor Arthur Phillip and other officers, exchanging charts and letters. He sent his last dispatches back to France from this spot, handing over journals, maps, and a letter to his wife. In them, he described the expedition's progress and hinted at plans to head north into the Solomon Islands before returning home. On March 10, 1788, the Boussole and the Astrolabes sailed away from Bot Bay, their masts vanishing over the horizon. No one in Europe would ever see them again. Months passed with no word, and by the following year, concern grew in France. The revolution had not yet begun, but political tensions were rising, and news of the vanished expedition troubled the king. He ordered a search mission under the command of Brune d'Antre. But that effort also ended in difficulty, with no trace of Laperouse's ships found. For decades, the fate of the expedition remained a complete mystery. Theories range from violent storms to attacks by islanders, but without evidence, they were only speculation. The first real clues came much later, in 1826, when an Irish sea captain named Peter Dillon visited the island of Topia in the Solomon Islands. There he heard stories from locals about wreckage found on nearby Vanikoro. They spoke of two large ships that had been destroyed in a violent storm many years earlier, their remains scattered along the reefs. Dillon acquired some of the artifacts, pieces of metal, ship's fittings, and navigational instruments, and brought them back to Europe. Tests confirmed that the materials matched the style and construction of late 18th century French naval vessels. French authorities sent another expedition to Vanikoro to investigate. Reports from islanders described how one of the ships had been driven onto the reef during a cyclone, breaking apart in the surf. Many of the crew drowned, while survivors from the second ship managed to beach her safely before she too was destroyed. Those who lived built a small camp inland and tried to repair a smaller boat from the wreckage. It was said that some eventually set sail in this makeshift vessel, hoping to reach safety, but they were never heard from again. Artifacts recovered from Vanikoro included cannons, anchors, and personal items that once belonged to the officers. The remains of the camp were also found. Traces of stone ovens, rusted tools, and what appeared to be defensive walls, perhaps built-in fear of attack. While the accounts from local people offered valuable details, the exact sequence of events after the storm remained uncertain. Some stories claimed that a portion of the survivors lived on the island for years, intermarrying with the local population, while others insisted they were all gone within months. Even with these discoveries, questions lingered. Why had La Perouse chosen to sail near Vanikoro, a place surrounded by treacherous reefs? Was the storm truly the main cause of the disaster, or had damage from earlier voyages left the ships vulnerable? No written records from the final months of the expedition have ever been found, suggesting that the captain's logs and charts went down with the wrecks or were lost during the survivors' desperate attempts to flee. In the years that followed, the story of La Perouse became part of French legend. During the Revolution, King Louis XVI himself, while imprisoned, reportedly asked, "Has anyone heard news of La Perouse?" It was a rare moment of shared national curiosity in a time otherwise dominated by political turmoil. Books, paintings, and memorials kept the tale alive, often portraying the lost commander as a symbol of courage and exploration. Modern dives on the reefs around Vanikoro have brought up more of the ship's remains. Wooden beams preserved in the shallow waters lie scattered among coral growth, while iron objects bear the scars of years under salt water. Each discovery confirms more of the islander's old accounts, yet still fails to reveal the final fate of the men who walked away from the wrecks into the dense island forest. Some researchers believe they died from disease or malnutrition soon after. Others think a few may have reached other islands but left no trace strong enough to survive in the historical record. More than 2 centuries have passed since the Buzel and the Astrolabe slipped away from Botany Bay, but the unanswered questions still hold their grip. The La Perouse expedition began with the optimism of discovery, carrying the finest navigators and scientists of France across oceans. It ended on a remote Pacific island, far from the courts and cities that had sent it forth, leaving behind only fragments scattered in sand and reef. And as with many stories of ships that never returned, the seers kept the rest. The doomed Andes, flight, search party. Snow clouds hung low over the Andes in August 1990 when Swiss Air Flight 404 vanished from radar. The aircraft, carrying both passengers and crew, had been on a route over one of the most unforgiving mountain ranges in the world. When contact was lost, authorities assumed the plane had gone down somewhere in the high peaks, a region where weather could shift in minutes and visibility could drop to nothing. Within hours, a search party was organized made up of experienced mountaineers, rescue workers, and local guides who knew the ridges and passes better than anyone. They left with urgency, believing that finding survivors was a matter of hours, not days. From the very beginning, the mission was plagued by obstacles. Helicopters struggled against fierce winds, and the snow was so thick that even the most recognizable landmarks were buried under white. The rescuers moved on foot where they could, roped together in the deeper drifts, carrying equipment and supplies on their backs. Radio contact with base stations was unreliable, breaking in and out as the terrain blocked signals. Still, the search teams pressed on, marking each new location on their maps, hoping for a trail of debris, a sign of wreckage, or even footprints in the snow that might lead them to survivors. A few days into the operation, strange reports began to circulate among the teams. Some rescuers claimed to hear faint mechanical sounds in the distance, like an engine turning over or metal shifting in the wind. Others swore they saw flashes of light on nearby slopes at night. Though there were no other expeditions in the area, every time they tried to move toward these signals, the weather closed in, forcing them to retreat. It was as if the mountains themselves were keeping them from finding the source. Progress slowed further as exhaustion set in. The cold was constant, biting through layers of clothing and freezing water bottles, solid within minutes. Sleep was shallow and broken, with teams waking in the night to the sound of avalanches, rumbling somewhere in the darkness. Food. Rations grew tight and the air at higher altitudes left them short of breath after just a few steps. Morale dropped, though no one wanted to admit it out loud. They all knew they were far beyond the time window in which survivors could realistically be found, but they continued anyway, driven by duty and the hope of bringing closure to the families waiting below. One group, led by a veteran climber named Miguel Herrera, decided to break away from the main search to follow a narrow path that had been overlooked. The trail was treacherous with steep ice walls and loose rock hidden beneath snow. Days later, when they failed to report back, the rest of the rescue effort began to worry. Searchers sent to find Herrera's group discovered a campsite buried in drifted snow. Inside the tents, supplies were scattered as if they had been left in a hurry, and the footprints outside stopped abruptly a few meters from the site. No signs of struggle were found, and no tracks led away. The disappearance of Herrera's team cast a shadow over the entire operation. Some rescuers began to speak of the mountains as cursed, pointing to old stories about travelers who vanished without explanation. Others dismissed it as fear taking hold after too many days in hostile conditions. Still, the fact remained that more men had now gone missing during the search than were even confirmed lost in the original crash. The situation forced officials to scale back the mission, concentrating on lower elevations where the risk was less extreme. In the third week of the search, a small piece of debris was finally located. A fragment of fuselage lying half buried in a snowfield. It was badly damaged, edges twisted and burned, suggesting the plane had hit with enormous force. The discovery was both a breakthrough and a disappointment, as there was still no sign of the main wreckage or the people aboard. A helicopter was sent to photograph the area, but incoming storms forced it back before it could land. By the time the weather cleared, fresh snow had covered the site completely, as if erasing it from memory. Rescuers who returned from the higher passes began showing signs of severe frostbite and altitude sickness. Some spoke of vivid dreams and waking visions, flashes of figures standing on ridges, voices calling from just beyond sight. Medical staff at the base camp attributed this to fatigue and oxygen deprivation. But the accounts were unsettling enough that a few men refused to climb again. One even left the camp altogether, walking down to the nearest village without telling anyone, later saying he felt something watching from the peaks. By the fourth week, the search was officially called off. Winter storms were growing worse, and it was clear that any remaining evidence of the crash would have to wait until the spring thaw. Helicopters made a final sweep over the valleys and ridges before the teams packed their gear for the long journey out. Many of the rescuers left without answers, burdened not only by the failure to find the missing plane, but by the loss of their fellow searchers, whose fate remained as mysterious as the one they had come to solve. When the snow melted months later, another expedition tried to retrace the original route of Herrera's group. They found only scraps, a broken ice axe, a piece of torn fabric that might have been from a parka, and the remains of a campfire long extinguished. The mountain pass they had chosen ended in a sheer cliff, leading some to believe they had fallen during a storm. Yet no bodies were ever recovered, and without them the truth remained out of reach. As time went on, the search brought only questions. The crash site of Flight 404 was never truly located. The story became part of local lore, a cautionary tale about the dangers of the high Andes. Pilots spoke of downdrafts and sudden whiteouts that could drag even experienced crews off course. Climbers told new arrivals about the search party that disappeared, their words half warning and half ghost story. For the families, the lack of certainty meant grief had no clear ending. The landscape where Flight 404 vanished has changed little. The same peaks still rise into the clouds just as they did in 1990. Somewhere among them, the wreckage still waits, hidden beneath rock and snow. Whether the lost searchers are there too, or whether the Andes claimed them in some other way, is a question that has never been answered. What is certain is that both tragedies, the missing plane and the rescuers who went after it, are now bound together. Another unsolved chapter in the long, cold history of the high places of the world. The disappearance of the MV Joyita crew, the sight of the MV Joyita drifting aimlessly in the South Pacific in November 1955, was something no experienced seafarer could ever forget. She was found listing heavily to one side, her hull fouled with barnacles and her decks eerily silent. The vessel was in poor shape but still afloat, the pumps not running despite water in the Bess. Most unsettling of all, the 25 people who had been aboard her were nowhere to be seen. From the moment the first rescue crew stepped on board, it was clear this was no ordinary abandonment at sea. Search teams had been combing the waters between Apia, Samoa and the Tokala Islands for days after the Joyita failed to arrive at her destination. The voyage had been routine when she departed on October 3rd, carrying a mix of cargo, medical supplies, timber and food, along with her passengers and crew. Captain Thomas Miller, a man with decades of experience at sea, had seemed confident about the journey. But the discovery of the vessel nearly 600 miles off course raised more questions than answers. Inside, the signs of a sudden departure were unmistakable. Cups and plates sat where they had been left, as though a meal had been interrupted. A doctor's bag lay open with medical instruments scattered nearby. Clocks had stopped at 10:25, suggesting a power failure. Yet the radio was found tuned to the distress frequency. However, the radio itself was faulty, its wiring corroded, and its range limited. The lifeboats were missing, but there was no sign of panic. No torn clothing, no signs of a struggle, no bodies in the surrounding waters. Investigators at the time tried to piece together a timeline of events from what the vessel revealed. The Joyita had a history of mechanical troubles, and her engines were unreliable. One was completely inoperable, and the other had failed during the voyage. The bilge pumps were not working, leaving her vulnerable to flooding. It was possible, they reasoned, that the crew had decided to abandon ship, believing she was sinking. But that theory clashed with the fact that Joyita's hull was designed to be virtually unsinkable thanks to her buoyant structure. When word spread of the discovery, theories began to take hold far beyond the South Pacific. Some claimed piracy was the most likely cause, imagining armed raiders boarding the vessel and forcing everyone off. Others pointed to the cargo, noting that the medical supplies included morphine, valuable enough to be stolen. A few even speculated that the crew had been taken by a passing ship, whether for rescue or dark purposes. Yet, there was no evidence of gunfire, no theft of non-cargo items, and no survivor accounts to confirm such stories. Survivor accounts, of course, never came. Not a single person from the Joyita was ever found, despite extensive searches by both air and sea. The currents in the region could carry debris or bodies vast distances, but the complete absence of any trace was unusual. Weather reports suggested no storms had passed through the area during the voyage, removing the possibility of a sudden squall sweeping the lifeboats away. Attention turned to the captain himself. Miller had a reputation for being proud and unwilling to accept help. Some thought he might have insisted on pressing forward despite engine failures and the flooding, and that his crew or passengers might have disagreed, leading to conflict. But there were no signs of violence aboard the ship, no bloodstains or broken objects. Others wondered whether the leaking hull and failed pumps had simply convinced the group that they could not remain aboard, prompting them to take to the lifeboats. If so, they might have been lost to the ocean when help was only hours away. An even stranger possibility emerged when examining the state of Joyita upon recovery. She had been riding high in the water, almost too high for a vessel carrying such cargo, which hinted that she had been partially unloaded at some point. Where that cargo went and who might have taken it was never resolved. Some believed it supported the idea of another vessel boarding her at sea. Others thought it could be explained by buoyancy changes caused by flooding and uneven weight distribution. The The truth was impossible to determine from the physical evidence alone. The crew's fate has remained an enduring maritime mystery for nearly 7 decades. Ships vanish at sea with distressing frequency, but rarely are they found in a state like the Hoitita. Abandoned, but still seaworthy, with no sign of disaster strong enough to justify such a decision. The lack of communication equipment capable of broadcasting far enough meant that if trouble struck, they could have been unseen and unheard in the middle of a vast ocean. Since then, the case has drawn researchers and historians back in time and again, poring over old records and eyewitness accounts. Each time, they return to the same central problem. Gita herself survived, so why didn't her people? Every detail, from the stopped clocks to the missing lifeboats, offers only fragments of an explanation without providing the whole picture. In maritime lore, the MV Joyta holds a place next to the Mary Celeste, an enduring riddle of the oceans. She's been called the ghost ship of the South Pacific.
A fitting title for a vessel whose final voyage seems to have been swallowed whole by the ocean's secrets.
Whether the crew met their end through human malice, mechanical failure, or a simple but fatal misjudgment, no one will ever truly know. The waves have long since erased whatever evidence they carried, leaving behind only a drifting hulk, unanswered questions, and a story that continues to haunt the maritime world. The fate of the HMS Erebus and HMS Terror shore parties. The frozen coastline of King William Island in the Canadian Arctic has kept its secrets well. In 1845, the British expedition led by Sir John Franklin set out aboard the HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, seeking the fabled Northwest Passage. Both ships were strong, specially outfitted for polar conditions, and well provisioned. Yet when the last European eyes saw them near Baffin Bay, no one could have imagined how quickly the expedition would dissolve into tragedy. Years later, searchers would find scattered remains along the shores, signs that small groups of men had tried to survive on land after the ships became trapped in ice. Arctic explorers sent to find Franklin's party were the first to hear unsettling reports from Inuit hunters. They spoke of pale, starving men stumbling southward over the ice, hauling sledges laden with supplies. The accounts described their clothing in tatters, faces gaunt, and movements slow, as if each step were a battle. Some had collapsed where they walked, never to rise again. These reports matched with later discoveries, skeletal remains lying beside abandoned cooking pots, buttons, and fragments of canvas. The shore parties appeared to have left the safety of their ships in desperation. Notes later recovered told part of the story. The Erebus and Terror had become locked in ice for more than a year, and the crews were running low on food. Disease had already claimed several lives, including that of Franklin himself. The decision to abandon the ships was likely one of survival, but the men who set out faced a landscape without mercy. The frozen terrain offered no shelter, no easy source of food, and temperatures that could kill within hours without protection. Relics found in the decades that followed painted a grim picture. Tin cans of preserved meat were discovered split open, their contents long spoiled. Rusted tools lay beside crude stone hearths, suggesting attempts to cook whatever the men could catch or scavenge. Some remains showed signs of cut marks on the bones, leading some historians to suggest that in their final days, the survivors may have turned to cannibalism to stay alive. The evidence was controversial, yet it seemed to match both the Inuit accounts and the desperation such conditions would breed. The search for more details continued into the late 19th and 20th centuries. Expedition after expedition scoured the Arctic coastlines, mapping out the trails where these small groups had likely traveled. Often they found human remains buried shallowly in frozen ground or exposed to the elements. Personal effects like watches, combs, and fragments of uniforms made it clear these were officers and sailors from the lost expedition. Each find raised as many questions as it answered. Why had they split into smaller groups? And why had none survived to tell their story? King William Island itself became a place of haunting discoveries along its western shore. Searchers uncovered a boat mounted on a sledge, abandoned and still packed with blankets, clothing and chocolate.
Luxuries that should have offered some comfort.
Yet, there was no sign of its owners. The implication was clear. Even with supplies in hand, the men could not outrun the cold, the hunger, or the sheer isolation. Survivor notes would have been invaluable, but only one official message was ever recovered. Written in 1847 and later updated in 1848, it confirmed the death of Franklin and gave the last known location of the ships. After that silence, the shore parties left behind only mute testimony in the form of their possessions and their bones. The conditions they faced were far beyond what most 19th century sailors could endure, even with polar equipment. Modern researchers added a layer of scientific explanation to the mystery. Analyses of bone fragments have shown unusually high levels of lead, likely from poorly soldered food tins and possibly from the ship's water systems. Lead poisoning could have caused confusion, weakness, and poor decision fatal handicaps in the Arctic. Combined with scurvy, starvation, and frostbite, it might explain why the men never made it to safety despite being only hundreds of miles from potential rescue. Much of what is believed about the fate of these shore parties endures through the oral histories of the Inuit. Passed down for generations, they describe encounters with the last survivors who are said to be too weak to hunt or even light a fire. These accounts, once dismissed by British authorities, have been repeatedly validated by archaeological finds in the same areas the Inuit described. Without their testimony, the movements of the shore parties might never have been traced so precisely. The later discovery of the wrecks themselves, the Erebus in 2014 and the Terror in 2016, offered new insights into the expedition as a whole, but they shed little light on the final days of the men who left for shore. The ships were found far from where the crews had abandoned them, suggesting that shifting ice may have moved them after the fact. For the shore parties, however, the ships had already become unreachable tombs, locked in ice and shadow, each artifact found along. The coast still feels like a fragment of a puzzle whose final image will never be seen. A shoe was found half buried in gravel, a spoon with initials carved into the handle, a scrap of wool still showing its navy dye. These are the silent witnesses to a desperate gamble against the Arctic.
One that failed every man who took it.
The fate of the Erebus and Terror shore parties remains one of the most haunting stories of survival and loss in polar history. Frozen in place, waiting for answers that may never come. The disappearance of the SS Warrar, the SSA left Durban, South Africa on July 26, 1909, bound for Cape Town. She was a new ship by the standards of the time, launched only the year before and proudly hailed as the Titanic of the South for her size and luxury. On board were 211 people, including passengers and crew, many of them traveling for business or returning home. The weather was calm as she set out, and nothing suggested that within hours she would vanish so completely that no confirmed trace of her has ever been found. A small steamer, the Clan McIntyre, was the last vessel known to have seen her. The Warrar was spotted later that same day, steaming steadily along the South African coast. The Clan McIntyre's crew reported no distress signals, no strange maneuvers, just a ship keeping her course. By the next morning, the sea was rough with rising swells and heavy winds. Somewhere in those dark hours, the Warrar disappeared into the vastness of the Indian Ocean, taking every soul on board with her. The search began almost immediately. Several ships scoured the route between Durban and Cape Town, looking for wreckage or survivors.
Not even a lifeboat turned up.
It was as if the ship had been swallowed whole. This lack of debris puzzled searchers because even the worst storms usually leave something behind: wood, cargo, or at least a life ring. The complete absence of evidence fueled speculation that whatever happened was sudden and catastrophic. Among the theories, some believed the Warrar might have been struck by a powerful rogue wave. These walls of water, rare but deadly, can tower over 80 ft and appear without warning. A ship caught broadside could be rolled over and sunk in moments. In such a case, the vessel might have gone down so fast that the crew had no time to send a signal or launch lifeboats. The Indian Ocean, especially along the southern coast of Africa, is notorious for such dangerous seas. Others looked at the ship's design. The Waratah was built as both a cargo and passenger vessel with a high superstructure to accommodate its cabins. Some marine experts suggested that this made her top-heavy and less stable in rough weather. If she encountered heavy swells and strong winds, she might have developed a dangerous list, making recovery nearly impossible. Supporters of this theory pointed to earlier complaints from passengers on her maiden voyage when she reportedly rolled heavily in moderate seas. Witness accounts added another layer of mystery. A ship named the Harlow later reported seeing smoke on the horizon the morning after the Waratah was last sighted. The smoke rose briefly and then vanished, followed by a faint smell of burning. The Harlow's crew assumed it was a steamer in the distance, perhaps adjusting its boilers, but in hindsight, some wondered if they had glimpsed the final moments of the Wara, possibly on fire before sinking. No physical evidence ever linked this sighting to her, but the timing was difficult to ignore. Families of the passengers and crew clung to hope for months. Letters were sent to ports across the Indian Ocean, asking if perhaps the Waratah had been blown off course and had docked somewhere remote. Rumors spread that she might have been captured or diverted. Search ships extended their patrols farther and farther from the original route, but each day that passed made the truth harder to deny. The Waratah was gone. Over the years, expeditions have tried to find her wreck. Some used sonar to map the ocean floor, targeting areas where the currents might have carried a sinking vessel. Others examined undersea ridges and canyons where debris might be hidden from view. A handful of possible sonar returns have been noted, but none confirmed as the Wara. The coastline's shifting sands and the depth of the waters make the task especially difficult. The disappearance left a lasting impact on South Africa. The Wara had been a symbol of modern engineering, and her loss without explanation shook public faith in maritime safety. Newspapers followed every lead, often sensationalizing claims of ghost sightings. One particularly strange rumor told of a phantom ship seen off the coast in later years, matching the Waratah's description, but these stories faded as time passed without solid proof. Even today, the Waratah's fate remains one of the sea's most enduring mysteries. Theories range from sudden capsizing to collision with the submerged object or even an undetected structural failure. Yet without wreckage, each idea is built on fragments of testimony and educated guesses. The Indian Ocean has kept her secret for more than a century, and every passing year makes the chances of finding her smaller. For those who lost family aboard, the lack of answers has been the hardest part. A grave in the ocean leaves no marker to visit, no closure. The Wara sailed out of Durban full of life, conversations, and plans for the days ahead. In less than 24 hours, that world was erased without a single distress call, leaving behind only silence, questions, and a name that has become synonymous with vanishing without a trace. The tragic end of the Burke and Wills expedition. The journey of Robert O'Hara Burke and William John Wills began with great ambition. In August 1860, the two men led a team from Melbourne, intending to cross the Australian continent from south to north. The expedition was heavily funded and carried enormous public attention, with crowds gathering to watch them depart. Their route would take them through some of the harshest and least understood terrain in the country, but the optimism at the start drowned out any sense of danger. Burke, a former police officer with a reputation for boldness, and Wills, a skilled surveyor and scientist, were determined to make history. Alongside crates of food and a store of firearms, their baggage included the unlikely presence of a cedar-top table. This made their progress slower than expected. By the time they reached Menindee in New South Wales, delays and disputes among the men had already begun. From there, Burke pushed ahead toward Cooper Creek, where they established a depot camp. It was here that a decision was made that would shape the fate of the expedition. Burke chose to take only 3 men with him for the final push to the Gulf of Carparia, leaving the rest behind to wait for his return. In December 1860, Burke, Wills, John King, and Charles Gray set off from Cooper Creek toward the north. The journey was grueling from the start. Summer temperatures scorched the land, and their supplies began to dwindle faster than expected. Waterholes were often dry, and the men relied heavily on their pack animals, which in turn struggled to survive. Still, they pressed forward, covering hundreds of miles through remote territory. After nearly 2 months, they reached the mangrove swamps near the Gulf, only a few kilometers from the northern coast. The wet terrain and their weakened state prevented them from reaching the ocean itself, but they had effectively crossed the continent. The return trip proved far more deadly than the journey north. Monsoon rains turned dry ground into bogs, slowing their progress. Food was running low and hunting brought little success. Charles Gray began to weaken severely, suffering from an illness that may have been linked to spoiled food. He died in April 1861, just days before the survivors reached Cooper Creek again. The remaining 3 buried him quickly, their own strength too limited for anything more. When Burke, Wills, and King finally arrived back at Cooper Creek, they found the depot deserted. The men they had left behind had waited for months, but had departed only hours earlier, leaving behind a small cache of food buried beneath a tree marked with the word "dig." This cruel twist of timing meant the explorers had missed their companions by less than a day. The supplies they dug up gave them only a brief reprieve from hunger. Rather than attempt to follow the departing party, Burke decided they should try to reach a distant cattle station to the south. This choice led them deeper into the country they did not fully understand, where food and water were even scarcer. They began eating nardoo, a type of fern seed used by local Aboriginal people. Without proper preparation, however, nardoo contains toxins and offers little nutrition. The explorers' bodies grew weaker, even as their stomachs remained full. By June 1861, both Burke and Wills were near death. Wills, too weak to continue, asked King to leave him with a small supply of food, while he rested under a tree. Burke and King went on, but Burke collapsed not long after, unable to move. His last recorded words to King were an instruction not to bury him, but to leave him in the open for the wild animals. King, now alone, returned to find Wills already dead. King's survival was due entirely to the kindness of the Yandruanda people, who had been watching the expedition for some time. They provided him with food, shelter, and care until a rescue party finally arrived in September 1861. King was the only member of Burke's final push to make it out alive. His accounts of the journey provided the first details of the tragedy to the outside world. When news of the disaster reached Melbourne, the public reaction was one of shock and sorrow. Burke and Wills were hailed as national heroes. Their graves later relocated to the city for a public funeral. Yet beneath the patriotic praise, there was also criticism. Many questioned the planning of the expedition, Burke's leadership, and the lack of reliance on Aboriginal knowledge that might have saved lives. Over time, the Burke and Wills expedition became one of Australia's most famous tales of exploration, not for its success in crossing the continent, but for the harsh lesson it offered about underestimating the land. Their route is still marked by memorials, and their journals reveal the gradual shift from hope to desperation in heartbreaking detail. The story remains a symbol of courage, shadowed by the unforgiving reality of the outback. The land they crossed has changed little in its extremes, and the memory of their journey lingers in both the history books and the places where they struggled to survive. For all the honor given to their names, the fate of Burke and Wills stands as a reminder that in the vast interior of Australia, ambition alone is never enough. The mystery of the Mary Celeste's final voyage. Sailing out of New York Harbor on November 7, 1872, the Mary Celeste looked like any other merchant ship setting out across the Atlantic. She was a sturdy brigantine with a reputation for being dependable, and her cargo, 171 barrels of industrial alcohol, was bound for Genoa, Italy. At the helm was Captain Benjamin Briggs, an experienced sailor traveling with his wife Sarah and their 2-year-old daughter Sophia. The crew of 7 was all hand-picked for their skill and reliability. To those watching from shore, it seemed an ordinary voyage with no sign of the fate that awaited them. The ship made steady progress through the first weeks of the journey, though winter storms in the North Atlantic were always a concern. Captain Briggs kept a careful log, noting the ship's position and conditions each day. By late November, the Mary Celeste was somewhere west of the Azores, still on course and, according to the last entries, in good condition. There were no reports of sickness, mutiny, or serious damage, nothing to suggest that danger was near. And yet, within days, the ship would be found drifting. Her crew gone without explanation. It was the British Brig de Gracia that spotted her on December 4, 1872, about 400 miles east of the Azores. At first, the ship seemed simply to be sailing strangely, her course unsteady. Captain David Mohouse of the DEI. Gracia knew the Mary Celeste by sight as the two captains were acquainted. Thinking she might be in trouble, he ordered a small boat to be launched so his men could investigate. As they drew closer, the mystery began to take shape. Boarding the Mary Celeste, the sailors found her completely deserted. There were no signs of a struggle or violence. The sails were partly set, though some were damaged, and the rigging showed signs of rough weather. Below deck, the cargo was intact except for a few barrels of alcohol that had leaked. The ship's lifeboat was missing, suggesting the crew had abandoned ship, but why they had done so in open water and in a seaworthy vessel was baffling. Interestingly, some of the ship's personal logs were found torn and scattered, hinting at hurried or panicked actions just before abandonment. Additionally, the ship's chronometer was discovered, stopped at an unusual hour, raising questions about possible mechanical failures or sudden events disrupting normal operations. Personal belongings lay undisturbed in the cabins. Captain Briggs's clothing and navigation instruments were still in place, and there was food and water enough for 6 months. The ship's logbook ended on the morning of November 25th, placing the vessel within sight of the Azores. There was nothing in the final entries to hint at fear or an emergency.
Even the galley was in order with no sign of panic.
The quietness of it all only made the absence of life more chilling. Speculation began as soon as the Mary Celeste was towed to Gibraltar for investigation. Some believed that leaking alcohol fumes from the cargo might have caused an explosion scare, prompting the captain to order everyone into the lifeboat temporarily. If so, perhaps the rope connecting the boat to the ship had broken, leaving the crew stranded at sea. Others suggested sudden waterspouts or rogue waves, though the condition of the vessel made such events unlikely. Murmurs circulated about more unsettling possibilities. Piracy, mutiny, and foul play were all considered, but none matched the evidence or lack of it. Nothing had been stolen, and there was no damage consistent with an attack. The inquiry in Gibraltar concluded without a clear answer, ruling out deliberate wrongdoing but failing to explain why the crew had left a ship in no immediate danger. Over the years, the absence of answers turned the Mary Celeste into one of the most enduring maritime mysteries. New theories emerged with each retelling. Some suggested Captain Briggs misjudged the situation, thinking the ship was taking on dangerous amounts of water when in fact she was sound. Others imagined the lifeboat capsizing in bad weather after a hasty evacuation. With no survivors, every explanation was guesswork. The vessel herself continued to sail for years after the disappearance, passing through the hands of various owners. Yet her reputation was forever marked. Sailors considered her unlucky, and each new incident in her career seemed to add to her shadowed name. Eventually, she was deliberately wrecked in 1885 in a failed insurance fraud scheme, an inglorious end for a vessel whose name had become famous for far stranger reasons. The greatest unease comes from how the Mary Celeste's final days seemed so ordinary on the surface. The logs tell of calm weather and steady sailing. The condition of the ship points to no sudden catastrophe. The decision to leave her, whatever the reason, must have been made quickly and with the belief that it was the safer option. Somewhere out on that wide Atlantic, 9 souls vanished, leaving behind only the drifting ship as their monument. More than a century later, the Mary Celeste continues to provoke the same questions that arose in 1872. Without witnesses or survivors, the details remain frozen in time, a perfect puzzle of the sea. She lies now only in history books and maritime lore, but her image, sails slack, wheel turning without a hand to guide it, still drifts through the imagination as if waiting for the moment when her crew will finally step back on deck and explain where they have been. The doomed Soviet Dyatlov 2 expedition. In the bitter cold of the Ural Mountains during the winter of 1959, a second Soviet expedition known as Dyatlov 2 set out with hopes to explore new territory and uncover scientific data. Unlike the original Dyatlov Pass group, which had disappeared mysteriously in 1959, this team was made up of experienced hikers and researchers determined to avoid the mistakes of the past. They left Sverdlovsk in early December, carrying supplies, advanced equipment, and a clear mission to chart unexplored areas of the northern Urals. The Dyatlov 2 expedition was led by Yuri Popov, a seasoned mountaineer who had survived previous harsh winters. His team included scientists, geologists, and students, all familiar with the challenges of winter trekking. The goal was to map the region and gather meteorological and geological information. Preparations were thorough with careful planning of routes and rest points. They knew the terrain was unforgiving, but confidence ran high among the group. Their progress was steady as they moved deeper into the mountains. Initial reports sent via radio indicated that the weather was manageable and morale was good. They set up camps at regular intervals and kept detailed logs of their journey. But as December passed, conditions grew harsher. Temperatures plunged well below 30°C, and snowstorms became frequent. Visibility dropped to near zero, and the cold tested even the strongest members. On December 25th, the last message from the Dyatlov 2 expedition reached base camp. The transmission was brief, mentioning worsening weather and slight delays. No one expected what would come next. Weeks passed without contact, and when the team failed to return by the agreed date in early January 1960, authorities grew concerned. A search party was quickly assembled, retracing the planned route through the frozen wilderness. Initial search efforts uncovered radio transmissions from the Dyatlov 2 team that abruptly cut off mid-sentence, suggesting a sudden emergency. Additionally, some searchers reported finding unusual scorch marks on trees and strange metallic debris scattered near the last known campsite, hinting at unknown events beyond natural causes. The first campsites were found mostly intact, with evidence that the hikers had taken shelter from storms. However, as the search continued, signs of struggle appeared. Tents were missing and footprints led away from camp into thick forests and steep ravines. Investigators discovered abandoned equipment scattered over wide areas, including backpacks, boots, and cooking pots. The terrain itself was difficult, with icy cliffs and deep snowdrifts slowing the rescuers' progress. Bodies of the Dyatlov 2 members were found over several weeks, often far from each other and in disturbing conditions. Some were discovered without adequate clothing, as if they had fled in panic. Others showed severe injuries, fractured skulls, broken ribs, and crushed chests. Yet there were no external wounds to explain these traumas. Autopsies puzzled doctors. The injuries resembled the force of a car crash, but no accident had been reported. The investigators struggled to explain what could have caused such damage. Theories ranged from an avalanche to military testing in the area, but no conclusive evidence supported any one idea. The frozen landscape held its secrets tightly. Witnesses later reported strange lights in the sky around the time of the disappearance, fueling rumors of secret weapons or extraterrestrial involvement. Though these claims remained unverified, psychological stress was also considered a factor. Prolonged exposure to cold and isolation can lead to hallucinations and irrational behavior. It's possible that fear and exhaustion caused the hikers to abandon their tents, suddenly rushing into the night without shoes or proper clothing. Yet, this did not explain the severe internal injuries or why the group had split up instead of staying together for warmth. A puzzling detail was the discovery of radioactive traces on some clothing, which raised alarm and led to speculation about secret experiments or contamination. The Soviet government, known for its secrecy, released only limited information, adding to the mystery and suspicion. Some documents were classified for decades, fueling conspiracy theories that persist to this day. In spite of a detailed investigation, the Dyatlov 2 expedition remains shrouded in mystery. The harsh winter conditions combined with possible unknown forces made survival nearly impossible. The frozen mountains kept the truth buried beneath snow and ice, while the world was left with only questions, often overlooked beside the original. Dyatlov Pass tragedy, Dyatlov 2, nonetheless highlights the severe dangers faced by those exploring the Arctic's harshest reaches. The bravery of those who ventured into the cold, seeking knowledge, contrasts with the cruel fate they met in silence. That remote stretch of land where Dyatlov 2 vanished is still known for its relentless hazards. Only experienced climbers and researchers dare enter, aware of the lessons written in frozen footprints and broken tents. The story of the Soviet expedition serves as a warning. Sometimes nature's power and the unknown forces lurking in the mountains are more than even the strongest can withstand. The vanishing of the SS Orang Medan. In June of 1947, a distress call was received by several ships sailing near the Straits of Malacca, a busy shipping lane between the Indonesian island of Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula. The message was chilling and cryptic. All officers, including the captain, are dead, lying in the chart room and bridge. I die. No name was given, but the signal came from a ship identified as the SS Orang Medan. This haunting radio transmission would mark the beginning of one of the most mysterious maritime disappearances in history. The Orang Medan was said to be a Dutch cargo ship, or, according to some accounts, an Indonesian freighter. Regardless of its origin, the ship was reportedly carrying a cargo that remains unknown, adding a layer of intrigue to the tale. Upon receiving the distress message, a nearby American vessel, the Silver Star, altered course to investigate. The crew of the Silver Star was eager to offer assistance, unaware they were sailing toward a ghost ship shrouded in enigma. Some reports mentioned that shortly after the initial distress call, the Silver Star's crew attempted to send a message back, but received no response, adding to the eerie silence surrounding the event. Moreover, later investigations uncovered conflicting dates and ship registries, suggesting possible deliberate cover-ups or falsifications, which only deepened the mystery of the SS Orang Medan's true identity and tragic end. When the Silver Star approached the Orang Medan, the scene was unlike anything the rescuers expected. The ship appeared intact and was drifting without any visible crew. Boarding parties found the deck covered in a thin layer of frost, unusual for the tropical region, and the silence was deafening. Inside the ship's bridge and chart room, they discovered the crew's bodies, faces frozen in expressions of terror, eyes wide open and mouths agape, as if in their final moments they had witnessed unimaginable horror. No wounds or signs of struggle were present on the corpses. The entire crew, including the captain, had perished suddenly and mysteriously. Some reports say that the remains were found sprawled across the decks, while others claimed the bodies were clustered near the radio room. The atmosphere was heavy with an eerie stillness, and no explanation could be found for what had caused such widespread death. Efforts to find a cause for the tragedy led to various theories. One early suggestion was that the ship had been carrying dangerous chemicals such as nitroglycerin or other volatile substances which might have leaked and produced poisonous gas. This could explain the sudden death without injuries, but no concrete evidence of such cargo was ever confirmed. Another hypothesis pointed to carbon monoxide poisoning. Faulty engines or fires in the ship's engine room could have filled the
vessel with the deadly gas, causing crew members to suffocate without warning.
Yet, investigators found no signs of fire or engine problems. The ship was otherwise clean and appeared well maintained. More sensational theories emerged over time, ranging from secret military experiments to encounters with supernatural forces. Some speculated that the ship had stumbled upon a hidden weapon, or that paranormal activity caused the crew's deaths. These ideas, while popular in storytelling, lacked factual support and were often dismissed by experts. In the wake of the rescue attempt, the Urang Medan succumbed to the relentless sea. While the Silver Star crew prepared to tow the ship to port, a sudden fire broke out on board. The blaze spread rapidly, engulfing the vessel before anyone could contain it. Attempts to rescue equipment or records were abandoned as the flames intensified. Eventually, the ship exploded or sank, taking all physical evidence of the tragedy with it. Maritime historians and researchers have spent decades chasing down the facts behind the mysterious Urang Medan. Official records of the ship's registration and voyage remain elusive, leading some to question if the ship even existed. Some believe the tale is a hoax or exaggerated report, while others argue it's a real event shrouded by secrecy and lost documentation. Despite the doubts, the legend of the Urang Medan persists in maritime lore. It serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of the sea and the unknown perils that can befall even the most ordinary vessels. The image of the frozen crew staring silently into the void haunts those who hear the story. The Straits of Malacca, where the ship was last reported, remains one of the busiest and most dangerous shipping routes in the world. Its treacherous waters have claimed countless ships over centuries, but few mysteries are as chilling as that of the Urang Medan. In the end, the ship's fate and the cause of its crew's death may never be known. All that remains are the ghostly radio messages, scattered eyewitness accounts, and the memory of a vanished crew lost to the depths. The sea, as always, keeps its secrets tightly held beneath the waves. The strange death march of the Donner Party's forlorn hope. In the winter of 1846, the Sierra Nevada mountains turned into a tomb for one of America's most infamous pioneer groups, the Donner Party. This group of settlers traveling west in search of a new life in California found themselves trapped by early snowfall and brutal weather. As food ran out and hope faded, a desperate plan was made. A small group would attempt to break through the snow and seek help. This journey, known as the Fawn Hope, would become a haunting story of endurance, suffering, and tragedy. The Donner Party had left Illinois in the spring of 1846, joining a large caravan heading west. Their journey was already difficult, marked by delays and poor decisions, including a fateful shortcut suggested by a man named Lansford Hastings. This shortcut, called the Hastings Cutoff, added weeks to their travel time and led them through harsh desert and mountain terrain. By the time they reached the Sierra Nevada, autumn was ending and snow was falling earlier than expected. Trapped near what is now Donner Lake in California, the group faced starvation and freezing temperatures. the snow piled up rapidly, blocking all paths forward and back. Supplies dwindled and illness took hold. With more than 80 people stranded, including women and children, survival seemed unlikely without outside help. In late December, a small group of 15, later known as the Forlorn Hope, volunteered to risk a dangerous journey across the mountains to find rescue. This group included men, women, and 2 teenage boys, all weak from hunger, but determined to save those left behind. They set out on foot in mid-December, hoping to find help before it was too late. Their supplies were meager, a few pounds of dried meat and some bread, and they faced deep snow, freezing winds, and treacherous cliffs. Their path would take them across nearly 40 meters of mountainous wilderness, much of it untouched and uncharted. From the beginning, the Forlorn Hope faced challenges that tested their endurance. At times, the snow was waist-deep and progress was slow. Temperatures dropped below zero, and the thin clothing they wore offered little protection. The group moved cautiously, but had little choice but to push forward. Along the way, members grew weaker, some collapsing from exhaustion or frostbite. Despite these hardships, they pressed on, driven by the hope of reaching help and returning with supplies. Food quickly became the most desperate concern. The scant provisions ran out within days, forcing the group to survive on whatever they could find. Some accounts describe the eating of tree bark, pine needles, and even shoe leather. When these failed, the unthinkable happened. Some members resorted to cannibalism, consuming the bodies of those who had died along the way to survive. This grim choice is one of the darkest aspects of the Forlorn Hope's march. Tragedy continued to strike. 2 women, Sarah and Tamsin Donner, survived the entire ordeal and later became famous for their courage and care for others. But many others succumbed to the cold, starvation, and exposure. James Reed, one of the group's leaders, was actually expelled from the party earlier due to violence, but later led a separate rescue party. The Forlorn Hope's journey was fraught with both heroism and heartbreak. After nearly 3 weeks, some members of the group settled in California. Exhausted and barely alive, they alerted local settlers and government officials. Their arrival sparked a series of rescue attempts, but the winter conditions delayed relief. It was not until February 1847 that the first organized rescue party returned to the snowbound camp, only to find many of the original settlers dead and the survivors barely clinging to life. The Forlorn Hope story spread quickly, becoming a symbol of the dangers pioneers faced on the westward trail. It was a cautionary tale about the unforgiving wilderness and the price of poor planning. The survival of some members, especially the Donner women, was hailed as a testament to human willpower and endurance under unimaginable conditions. Through diaries, letters, and survivor testimonies, historians worked over the years to unravel the sequence of events. They revealed a picture of a group caught between hope and despair, forced into impossible choices by nature and circumstance. The Forlorn Hope's journey has been retold in countless books and documentaries, each time reminding audiences of the thin line between survival and death. Today, the site near Donner Lake is a historic landmark visited by those who want to remember the courage and tragedy of the party.
Markers and museums tell the story of the pioneers who risked everything to cross the continent. The mountains still stand silent,
a reminder of the harsh winter that stopped a group of hopeful settlers in their tracks and the desperate march that followed. The tragedy of the Donner Party's Forlorn Hope remains one of the most haunting tales in American history. It reveals the limits of human endurance and the dangers of the unknown frontier. More than 170 years later, it continues to evoke sympathy and awe for those who face death and hardship with nothing but determination to guide.